This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real events or persons is purely coincidental. This story is purely fictional and does not promote or encourage any form of violence. Spiderweb. Phoenix sighed and squared his shoulders as the troll spotted him and chortled roughly again. Okay, there could be a chance that dying 6 more times might launch him back into his real life. But there was an even bigger chance that it would just make his world and this one a hell pit of death and disaster. He couldn't take the easy way out by dying. Easy. Ha! It was time to duel with death in a world where death was programmed to win. Chapter 8. As far as he could tell, Phoenix had 3 advantages. He was smarter and faster than the troll, and there was nothing on this scoured flat plateau he could trip on. As long as he stayed on his feet and didn't succumb to exhaustion, he should be able to keep the troll occupied long enough for Marcus to complete his task. Of course, the troll had at least 2 big advantages of its own. It was indefatigable and indestructible. As Phoenix tensed himself to run, he wondered if his 3 outweighed the troll's 2. The creature trundled closer, looming over him like a mobile cliff face. Phoenix looked up and swallowed heavily. From this angle, it was hard to believe he had any chance at all. His legs shook. With one more fleeting glance at the brightening eastern horizon, Phoenix uttered the most childish war cry in history. He stuck his thumbs in his ears, poked out his tongue, and yelled, "Nya nya 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 nya, you can't catch me." He dove and rolled clumsily to the left. Tiredness and pain made his Aikido roll awkward and jarring, but it served the purpose. A huge cloud of dust roiled up from the place where he had just stood as the troll's granite fist smacked into the ground. Clambering to his feet, Phoenix clutched at his ribs with one hand and his sword scabbard with the other. He should have taken it off. It threatened to tangle his legs as he skipped aside again and ducked beneath a swinging stony arm. The hand passed so close to his head that the wind tossed his hair into his eyes. Impatiently, he brushed it aside and stumbled back, just as an enormous craggy foot stomped where he had been. This was never going to work. The troll was simply too big and too strong for him to keep being that lucky. He had to change, had to do the unexpected. Something his Aikido sensei often said came to mind. Avoid the falling rock. If he hadn't been so exhausted, Phoenix would have laughed at the irony of it. It was a central idea of Aikido. Don't be there. Don't go places where you were likely to get in trouble. If you did get into trouble, then running away was a great option. Phoenix suspected his master never thought the philosophy would have to be taken quite so literally. Aikido, that was it. Okay, he couldn't actually throw the troll or put it in a wrist lock, but there had to be some way he could use its own strength and movement against it. That was the very basis of how Aikido worked. An idea glimmered. Dragging long, painful gasps of breath, Phoenix turned and ran 20 long paces away, then doubled back towards the troll at full tilt. The beast stopped short, confused by this sudden change of tactics. It stood uncertainly for a moment, then raised a thick arm to swing down at Phoenix's darting form, missing when he dived directly between its legs at the last second. The momentum of its own arm carried the troll further forward than it probably intended. As it tried to twist its heavy body to follow Phoenix's path, the beast leaned just a fraction too far and overbalanced. It fell to earth with a resounding thump and a roar that shook the entire mountaintop. Phoenix didn't stop to watch. He only had a brief respite before the beast would be up again, and probably very angry this time. Glancing around, he spotted Marcus working frantically with a smoky branch. Several trees around the clearing were smoldering nicely. Phoenix noted with admiration that the Roman had chosen to set fire to trees evenly spaced around the mountaintop. The troll would have to stay in the clearing to avoid the fires, but there weren't enough alight, and dawn was still at least 10 minutes away. The creature could still assess if it wanted to. Time for Plan B. If only he had a Plan B. "I need a rope," he yelled. Marcus nodded and reached beneath his fur coat. Rapidly, he unwound a long, thin rope from his waist. Phoenix decided now was not the time to ask why it was there in the first place. He was just grateful his companion was so well prepared. Snatching it with a brief nod, Phoenix staggered back into the clearing as the troll unfolded itself and pushed to its feet. Star Wars time, he thought grimly, just like Luke taking out the Empire's walker on the snow world of Hoth. With hasty, trembling fingers, he knotted the rope into a huge lasso and laid it out on the ground like a giant snare. Next, he laid the free end in a long, straight line and backed away a few steps. The troll paused and watched Phoenix with an air of confused stupidity. It clearly couldn't work out why this puny human was laying such an obvious and ineffective trap. There was no way a troll could be snared by the strength of one man. It peered uncertainly at the loop and at the loose, untethered rope. Then with a rough laugh, it placed one foot unconcernedly smack into the middle of the lasso. Instantly, Phoenix darted forward and snatched up the free end and ran backward, pulling the loop taut around the stony leg. The troll laughed again and stepped back, jerking the rope tighter and pulling Phoenix off his feet. He managed a scrappy breakfall that protected his ribs but winded him. Holding onto the rope, he scrambled upright as the troll trod heavily toward him. Again, Phoenix rushed suicidally toward the monster. Again, he launched himself between its open legs. This time, the beast was a shade quicker, and he barely escaped being hit like a croquet ball by the swinging fist. This time, the troll did not overbalance. Instead, it turned around to face this annoying gnat of a human. In doing so, it did exactly what Phoenix had hoped it would. It tangled the rope around its own legs. He ran as fast as his burning thighs would carry him around the thing. He stayed just out of reach of those fists, darting in every direction to confuse and encircle the troll. It twisted and turned to follow him until the rope was thoroughly snarled around it. Finally realizing its dilemma, the troll stood still and looked down at itself. Perplexed, it reached down to pluck at the thin cord. With perfect timing, Marcus managed to get a dozen more trees to burst into flame right in front of it at that moment. The troll looked up. The heat and flames leapt. Raising rocky hands to shield its face, the troll tried to back away. Then, with the booming sound of a mountainside avalanche, it toppled slowly to the ground. Phoenix jumped aside and punched the air with a whoop of joy. He stumbled to Marcus's side, and the pair of them watched the troll thrash and twist on the bare earth. More trees flared into life. The circle of fire was complete, but it wouldn't last long. With a loud twang, the thin rope snapped, and the troll managed to bend its knee. "Come on, come on," Phoenix breathed, staring at the eastern horizon. A thin, shivering slip of sun appeared. The troll roared. Phoenix imagined he could hear a touch of fear in that rough sound now. Its struggles increased. Rope twanged, snapped, and fell away in loose segments. The troll heaved itself to its feet and lumbered toward the nearest trees, but the fires there were reaching peak intensity. It backed away with a roar of pain and confusion. Turning, it ran directly toward where Phoenix and Marcus were half hidden, behind an unburned sapling. Marcus gasped and backed away involuntarily. His movement must have caught the troll's eye, and it raised a murderous fist right above them. Phoenix caught Marcus's elbow and dragged him aside. "Run!" The two boys bolted, But Phoenix's twisted ankle chose that moment to give out completely, and he fell to the ground in a heap. Marcus stopped and turned back to help. "Go," Phoenix yelled, afraid they would both be killed. "Get out." At least with his digital lives, he had a chance of surviving. Marcus had only one life in this world. The Roman shook his dark head and bent over to haul Phoenix to his feet. He was too late. Overhead, branches snapped. Burning pine needles and glowing embers fell around the boys like fireworks. A fist of unyielding stone descended unstoppably toward their unprotected heads. Phoenix shoved at Marcus, pushing him aside. He stumbled away with a look of horror as he realized what Phoenix had done. No. There was a flash of brilliant white light, tinged with purple blues that burnt into the brain and left strange after-images on the inside of Phoenix's eyelids. Marcus's despairing yell was overwhelmed by a horrendous, cracking sound. It echoed like the crunching, grinding, snapping cacophony of noise an iceberg makes as it calves into the sea. Or the sound of an earthquake destroying whole cities. Then, silence. Profound, utter silence, except for the crackle and sizzle of pine trees fizzling into bare trunks around them. Reddish sunlight poured through the smoky haze. Phoenix slowly turned his head and looked up. 2 feet above him, the troll's gray fist hung, frozen in midair. With a gasp of shocked relief, Phoenix dragged himself out from beneath that looming pile of stone. Marcus hurried to help him up, and together they hobbled back uphill to get a better view. Teetering on the edge of the hilltop clearing was an enormous solid statue of a troll. Spring sunlight had done its job. The troll had petrified, just as Truda predicted. As the boys watched, gravity took charge and the stones disintegrated. An arm shattered and smashed to earth just where Phoenix had lain. Then the other arm, the head, a knee snapped. Suddenly the whole lot imploded into a large, shapeless pile of gray rocks, tumbling down slope. Phoenix coughed as dust rose and added to the smoke already drifting around. He exchanged looks with Marcus. "It worked." "Seems that way," the Roman agreed, but there was a look in his dark eyes that hinted he would remember this night forever. "I owe you my life." Phoenix shrugged, grimacing as the motion sent stabbing pains into his chest. "I think we're pretty even." There was a pause as the two silently surveyed the scene. "Sorry about your rope," Phoenix said. Marcus shrugged, still watching rocks roll away. "Easily replaced. And your sword," Phoenix added. "Now that is going to be more difficult." There wasn't much else they could really say. Now was the time for some witty quip like, well, he took the rocky road to enlightenment. But Phoenix was too tired to summon up the energy to utter it. Come to think of it, the idea of enlightenment was probably not a Roman one anyway. Marcus would just give him a blank look, and a perfectly good pun would go to waste. Where was Jade when he needed her? Speaking of which, Phoenix turned a slow circle. The sun had cleared the horizon, and the last of the burning trees was dwindling into smoldering sticks. The hilltop looked like it had been hit by a bomb. Squinting through the smoke and sunlight, he tried to work out where they were. He'd become so turned around that there was no way of telling. He thought about following the path of destruction left by the troll, but they had led the creature in circles last night, and it would take hours to get back to the cave. By then the others would have left for the village. Water glinted off to the east, through the glare, probably the same large lake they had been aiming for yesterday. Their best bet was to head in that direction, with the hope of finding Jade and the others along the shoreline. It was a long shot, but he couldn't think of anything else. Belatedly, Phoenix remembered his own resolution to be a better leader. He swung about to find Marcus gazing at him gravely. "Any idea which way to go to find the others?" Marcus gave him a rare, small smile. "I'm sure you'll think of something." Phoenix laughed, feeling a twinge in his abused ribs. "East, then, toward the lake." Marcus nodded agreeably. He slung Phoenix's arm over his shoulder, and together they staggered toward the distant lake. The pair made their way down the steep, rocky slope they had climbed so recklessly an hour before. Neither of them commented. Already, the hazards of the night began to fade into a dream. The fact they had survived was so outrageous that Phoenix began to wonder if, perhaps, one of Truda's godly relatives was watching out for them. Weirder things had happened here, and would probably keep doing so. It took 2 solid hours of walking and hobbling before they again saw a hint of water through the trees. They were utterly exhausted, and it was only the fear of what might have happened to the others that kept them going. Phoenix had no memory of most of the walk. He relied on Marcus to keep them going. He had to concentrate on putting one foot in front of the other. Pain shot through his ankle and chest with every step. The world beyond his feet blurred. It took all his willpower just to stay upright. If something attacked them now, they were dead. Hearing Marcus's sharp intake of breath, Phoenix raised his head slowly. Tall and barbarically dressed, a dozen heavily armed men stepped out from behind the trees and encircled them. Their long blonde hair lay loose over thick fur cloaks, rough cloth shirts, sturdy leather pants, and heavy boots. There was nothing barbaric or rough about the sharpness of their swords, however. One of them stepped forward and growled what might have been a challenge, or perhaps a question, but it sounded like gibberish. Phoenix blinked vaguely and looked at Marcus. The Roman shook his head to show he couldn't understand either. The circle of long, unpleasantly pointy broadswords closed in threateningly. The leader repeated his words in a sing-song voice that sounded suddenly almost familiar. Phoenix smiled dreamily. Truda had said they were in Sveiland. Marcus had named the Swabian Sea, which meant they must be in Sweden. Knowing where they were didn't give him the power to speak ancient Swedish, unfortunately. A sword jabbed at his chest. Slowly, he raised his hands above his head, trying to ignore the sharp pain in his ribs. Marcus did the same. A second man came forward. He was smaller and darker than the others. He spoke to them in broken Latin. "You will come with us." Phoenix blinked slowly as the world began to spin in front of his eyes. "Are we your prisoners?" he managed to ask, also in Latin. The man nodded curtly, gesturing with his sword. Phoenix swayed on his feet. "Are we being taken to your village?" He wasn't sure if the words came out clearly, but the man nodded again. Marcus cast his companion a perplexed look. "Oh, good," Phoenix murmured, "but I think you'll have to carry me." He slid to the ground, welcoming the darkness that enveloped his exhausted body and mind. Chapter 9. At the sound of male voices outside their prison, Jade drew Bryn and Truda close. She pushed them behind her and faced the door boldly, trying to hide a shiver of fear. The rough timber door flew open, and a tall warrior stepped through, sword drawn. He glanced at Jade, then nodded to someone, and moved aside. Jade shoved her charges back against the timber wall and glared at him defiantly. But the warrior ignored her. A man stumbled through the door and sprawled on the dirt floor. Jade squinted against the light, trying to see. 2 more warriors strode in, bearing a limp body between them. They dumped it unceremoniously on the floor and left, closing the door. Outside, there was a short conversation, laughter, then silence. Inside the hut, the gloom was broken only by thin streams of dusty sunlight, sneaking through cracks in the door and thatched roof. One sunbeam fell onto the face of one of the young men lying prone on the floor. "Phoenix!" Jade dashed across the room and almost fell onto her unconscious companion's chest. Tears of relief started in her eyes as she felt his heart beating strongly beneath her hands. He was alive. She remembered the other prisoner. "Marcus, is that you too?" "Yes," the Roman replied, clambering to his feet to move stiffly to her side. Jade threw her arms about his strong shoulders and hugged him ruthlessly. He stayed still for a second, then returned the embrace briefly before letting her go. "I can't believe you're here," she sniffed, wiping her wet cheeks. Bryn and Truda ran up, delighted smiles on their faces. Bryn clouted Marcus on the arm with rough affection before crouching beside Phoenix. Truda smiled happily on all of them as though she had somehow arranged their reunion. "What's wrong with him?" Bryn asked Marcus. "We spent all night leading the troll away from you," the Roman boy replied. "He's exhausted." Fatigue roughened his voice. "Any injuries?" Jade asked professionally. There was undoubtedly more to the tale, but Marcus wasn't one to brag, and she wasn't going to push him. Phoenix would tell them all the details when he awoke. Marcus shook his head. "A few cuts and bruises on me." Phoenix did most of the work and took the worst hits. "He was limping, and I think he's hurt his ribs." "Well, I'd better check while he's unconscious then." Jade nodded. "Bryn, bring Marcus some of that water and food the villagers gave us. Truda, get some blankets for Phoenix. I'll get the hearth fire going." Jade worked on Phoenix's injuries, trying to clear her mind, but it was difficult. Phoenix was injured and exhausted because she had been reckless and scared and had done something truly stupid. If she hadn't been so jittery and brainless, she would have at least looked before eating those lily petals. She knew exactly what they did. If she just glanced at the flower before stuffing it in her mouth, she wouldn't have eaten it at all. She bit her lip, suddenly wondering if that were true. After all, she did know that water lilies contained a sedative, and she had been feeling overwhelmingly frightened. Would she really have refused if she'd seen what Truda was offering? Would she have had the strength to say no when she was desperate to dull the crushing fear? It was awful to admit, but she may not have. She might have let fear overcome her judgment. She might have eaten them anyway. Shivering with self-loathing, Jade wrapped her arms around herself and stared at her tired companions. Now they were prisoners because of her, too. This morning she'd awoken with a sick headache and guilt weighing heavily on her conscience. She'd allowed Bryn to talk her into following Phoenix's last instructions to find the village, and regretted it as soon as they'd walked into the hamlet of scattered thatched huts. A dozen warriors had captured them, taken away all their gear and put them in this hut. They hadn't even had a chance to explain anything, Jade remembered indignantly. Truda had tried to speak to them, but the burly men had just laughed at the young girl's efforts. When Truda had stomped her little feet and imperiously told them she was Thor's daughter, they had just laughed harder than ever. It had taken Jade 10 full minutes to calm Truda down after that. She shook herself, focusing on using her powers to heal the worst of Phoenix's hurts. Without her herb bag, she couldn't cure him totally, but he would mend with a little time. 2 fractured ribs, 1 badly sprained ankle, and a broken little finger. It could have been worse, but she still felt awful. When it was done, she sat back, drained. Marcus lay beside Phoenix, soundly asleep on a thin blanket. His eyes were ringed with purple-black circles, his face and hands filthy with soot. He hadn't even bothered to remove his smoke-scented, grubby furs. Jade stared at the two for a long moment, then sighed. She turned to the youngsters and gestured them closer. "You two didn't sleep much either." "I know." She smiled as Truda tried to cover a yawn. "Why don't you get some rest now? I've slept enough. I'll keep watch." Truda nodded amicably and curled up with her back against Phoenix. Her eyes drifted closed, and she was asleep in seconds. Bryn reached out and squeezed Jade's fingers. "It's not your fault," he whispered. Jade pressed his thin hand gratefully. She didn't trust herself to say anything. It was, and she knew it. It had been pure luck that nothing awful had happened to anyone while she was under the influence of the lily. Luck and Phoenix and Marcus's skills. Next time, she mightn't be so fortunate. Well, she resolved, silent, there wouldn't be a next time. She would never ever do anything as dumb as that again. When a voice penetrated layers of sleep and drew Phoenix slowly back from a warm, comfortable place. He groaned in protest and tried to push away a hand that stroked his forehead. "Go away, Mum," he muttered irritably. "I don't want to get up yet. School's not for ages." There was a girlish giggle from somewhere nearby. What was a girl doing in his sis bedroom? Abruptly, memories of the last week came flooding back. Amulets, Romans, druids, Stonehenge, death, snow, wolves, giant killer troll, barbarians. Phoenix sat straight up in shock, eyes wide. Sure enough, Jade, Truda, Bryn, and Marcus were all gathered close, peering at him with varying degrees of anxiety. Well, Truda was giggling. The rest were peering. He put a hand to his head as it began thudding. It seemed like every muscle in his legs ached, and his ribs felt bruised. He prodded them and wriggled his sprained ankle at the same time. Surprisingly, there were only slight twinges of pain. He felt amazingly healthy, apart from a headache and sore muscles. "How are you feeling?" Jade's worried voice intruded. He stared up at her, then around at the room. They were in some sort of small, windowless hut with a high, thatched roof. "Fine. Mostly," he replied absently. "Where are we?" "We're in a sphere village called Olshamar, on the edge of Lake Vatten in Sweden. They call it Svealand," Jade replied. Truda giggled again, covering her mouth with her hand. Jade sighed. "What?" "You just said Lake, Truda said, sniggering. "But that's what you said it was called. Vatten." Jade sighed. "That's because the word for lake is Vatten," Truda explained, shaking her head at Jade's stupidity. "Oh, good grief," Jade moaned, dropping her head into her hands. She looked over at Truda with an expression of resigned irritation that reminded Phoenix strongly of how his mother looked at him sometimes. "I never realized what a pain it is not to be able to speak the language," Jade complained to him. "Truda's the only one who can understand what the men outside are saying, but she doesn't know the Latin or Breton words for half of it, so she can't translate correctly. Although," she grinned and sat down on the dirt floor, forearms resting on her knees. "By the tone of their voices, they are probably not saying anything fit for small ears anyway." Bryn sniggered. Truda looked confused, then giggled as understanding dawned. Jade sighed, a frown pulling her slanted brows together over her nose. "The problem is, if we ever get out to see anyone, we don't stand a chance of getting help or pleading our case to be let free. What are we going to do?" It took Phoenix a full 30 seconds to reply as he tried to clear the last of the sleep fog from his aching head. He was thirsty, tired, starving, and bursting to go to the toilet. Now that he was awake, he remembered too. He was also seriously annoyed with her for going zombie on them with the lotus flower. How the heck was he supposed to know what to do about translating an obscure ancient dialect? He stalled, rubbing his hand over his wild, smoke-smelling hair. "Couldn't you just—" He made a gesture in the air like a magician waving a wand. "You know, magica some translation ability." Jade shook her head. I've tried everything I know, but I just don't have any spells that apply to the situation. The closest I could come was to give us all my ability to understand what trees are thinking, and somehow, she grimaced, I don't think that will help much. No, he snorted a laugh. I see your point. Hang on. He frowned, trying to remember the moments leading up to his capture. Wasn't there a guy who spoke Latin? Marcus nodded. There was, but he's a trader to the lands south across the Swabian Sea. He was only here until yesterday. He left as we entered the village. Helpful, Phoenix muttered. Look, I can't think properly. I'm half asleep, starving, thirsty, and desperate for the loo. Jade instantly apologized. She pointed out the primitive leather slop bucket in one corner, and when he'd used it, handed him some water and the stale remains of some bread and smoked meat. The others went to sit by the door, listening to their guards' conversations in hope of gaining something useful. After he'd assuaged the worst of his needs, Phoenix sighed and prodded his injuries again. He cocked his head at Jade, pointing to his ribs. Your handiwork. She flushed vividly red and looked away, nodding. Thanks. He was extremely grateful for the healing. If it hadn't been for my stupidity, she groaned, you wouldn't have been injured at all. I should have been awake to help you, not lying in a drugged-out coma because I was too cowardly to face my fears. He patted her awkwardly on the shoulder, not quite knowing how to deal with her in this mood. His lingering annoyance with her bad judgment faded. You're not a coward, Jade, and it wasn't your fault. Besides, he added as she glared at him, you couldn't have helped anyway. Didn't Bryn tell you? Jade sniffed, shook her head, and wiped her nose on the back of her sleeve. Your magic wouldn't have worked on a troll. They're immune. He smiled as her mouth dropped open. I'm guessing being in the troll territory was what caused you so much grief with your magic. And that's another thing. Those wolves obviously knew where they were pushing us. He frowned at the memory. If we ever see them again. You mean the wolves herded us into the trolls' territory deliberately? Jade blinked at him in astonishment. But wolves aren't that smart. I mean, I knew they were driving us somewhere. But I thought they were just... I don't know. I mean, why didn't they just kill us and eat us? Why go to so much trouble? Don't ask me. Phoenix shrugged. There was something weird about that big black one. It seemed to me like he wanted us dead, but didn't want to do the deed himself. Maybe they were spies for Feng Judai. Who knows? Jade bit her lip, then replied, but with a note of uncertainty in her voice. No. My spell. He can't find us here, remember? Anyway, forget the wolves. The point is, I still shouldn't have been stupid enough to eat that lily. I let you down. I'd never forgive myself if something happened to you both. Phoenix grimaced and held up his hands. Okay. You shouldn't have eaten the flower. You made a mistake. Welcome to the real world. Sort of. Build a bridge and get over it, Jade. We don't have time for wallowing in self-pity. He knew he was being harsh, but there really wasn't any room here for this sort of silliness. They needed Jade to be her usual, capable self if they were going to survive. For a moment he thought she was going to lash out at him in anger. Her fists clenched at her sides and her jaw clamped shut. Her brilliant green eyes flashed fire, and he wondered if she would do magic on him without thinking. Hey, he warned, don't get angry at me for telling you a truth you already knew. Remember the amulets. We have to finish this level and 3 more if you want to get home. Some of the fire went out of her face, so he continued more quietly. Let's concentrate on getting out of this village and on our way. She swallowed hard a couple of times, then let her hands relax. She nodded. But where do we go from here? she asked hopelessly. "We don't even know how to get to Asgard or Bilskirnir." "Well, let's work on getting out of here first," Phoenix shrugged. "Then we can worry about Asgard. Besides," his lips twisted in a knowing smile, "I'll bet Truda can tell us how to get there." "Why should she know?" Jade sounded defensive. "Well, to start with, it's her home," he pointed out mildly. She was being very touchy. "Plus, I've noticed she's pretty darn good at springing little surprises on us at the most inconvenient times. Watch." He caught Marcus's eye and waved the others over. The group sat in a tight circle on the packed earth floor, huddling around a small central hearth fire that provided meager warmth. Phoenix looked around. "So, any ideas on how we can get out of here?" Truda shook her head solemnly, as did Marcus. Bryn shrugged, and with a wicked gleam in his eye, picked up a stick from the fire. "We could set the place alight and escape in the confusion." Phoenix tried to think of a tactful way of telling him what a bad idea that was. It could be tricky to avoid being burned ourselves. He pointed out, "Besides, I think Marcus and I have had enough fire for a while, and they still have all our gear and weapons." Bryn threw the stick back into the fire and slumped with a defeated sigh. "No idea then." Phoenix raised an eyebrow at Jade, flicking her a knowing look. "Anyway," he asked in a deliberate, disappointed tone, "even if we could get out, how on earth are we supposed to get to Asgard to return Truda to Thor? I mean, yes, we know we're in Svealand, but we don't know which way to go from here." Marcus cast him a puzzled look. Bryn blinked in confusion, but Truda's blue eyes lit up, and she gave them all a blinding smile. "Oh, don't be silly. Everyone knows that all we have to do is get to Uppsala, find the Yggdrasil, and go down the Urdabrunner into Asgard." "Of course," she added blithely. "We'd have to be careful to stay away from the Guardians. Nidhogg, Gribak, Grafoluth, Goin, and Moin." "Ha!" Phoenix grinned triumphantly at Jade. "See, I told you she'd spring the answer on us." Then he frowned at Truda's bright, dirt-smudged face. "Of course. It would help if anything you just said made any sense at all. I understood about the first 10 words. After that, it was utter gibberish." Jade chuckled. Bryn clutched at his stomach and howled with laughter. Truda pouted and opened her mouth to argue with him, but she never got the chance. The door to the hut was flung open, crashing back against the wall. All 5 companions jumped in shock, hands automatically reaching for absent weapons. Little bits of disturbed thatch fell on their heads as they sprang to their feet. Silhouetted in the afternoon light, a strange, hideously deformed man-thing stepped toward them. They couldn't see its face clearly, but it seemed to have a long snout and pointed ears on top of a furry, vaguely man-shaped body. It growled something in a low, harsh voice and began limping forward, leaning heavily on a thick ash staff. Truda gasped. "It's the Leafbjotr." Chapter 10. "Oh man," Phoenix muttered. "Stop it with the gibberish already." Truda gurgled a laugh. "No, silly. He's the village Leafbjotr, the life-bringer." She didn't seem the slightest bit afraid of the thing walking stiffly toward them. But then, she was a goddess. The shape moved into the gentle orange glow cast by their fire, and its frightening features resolved into something much less scary. An older man, wearing loose furs and carrying a staff, draped over his head and back, a wolfskin, complete with head, fangs, and sunken empty eyes, created the illusion of monstrosity that had startled them. Beneath that gruesome relic was the much more normal face of the life-bringer. He raised thick, white eyebrows and said something incomprehensible. Truda translated. He asked if he can sit down. Marcus and Bryn hastily moved aside to make room around the fire. Their unexpected guest eased himself creakily down to join them. He laid his staff on the ground and held out his hands in a gesture of peace. Cautiously, the companions sat as well. The Lifebringer spoke again, his mouth almost hidden by a coarse white beard and mustache. Above, his pale blue eyes sparkled with intelligence. He pushed back the wolfskin hood to reveal a mane of grizzled gray hair. Truda struggled to translate. She bit her lip. He's asking something about the troll, but I don't know the words for it in your language. I think he wants to know where it is and what happened to it. She spoke something rapidly to the old man, her high, clear voice a contrast to his gruff, deep one. The Lifebringer nodded, frowning at her. Truda smiled. Yes, that's it. He wants to know what happened to the mountain troll. She looked expectantly at Phoenix and Marcus. The two young men exchanged glances. Jade thought quickly. She was fairly sure this society was very patriarchal. The old man obviously resented having to talk through a girl child, and he probably wouldn't appreciate it if Jade answered instead of Phoenix or Marcus. She leaned over and whispered a warning in Phoenix's ear. His answer had to be the right one, or they could be in serious trouble. He nodded his understanding, but gave her a look that clearly said he thought she was nuts, but shrugged. He began. It depends. Is having the troll around a good thing or a bad thing? Truda raised her eyebrows at him, but asked the Lifebringer the question anyway. The old man blinked at her in astonishment, then, to Jade's amazement, burst out laughing. He had a nice laugh, and his face creased into 1,000 wrinkles, making him much less intimidating. He looked like a slightly grubby Santa Claus. Truda giggled, too. I'm pretty sure it's a bad thing to have a troll around. Phoenix cast Jade an irritated, I told you so look. She ignored it. You never knew. It was stupid to own up to something until you knew if the person asking was happy about it or not. You learned that fast, growing up in a family of 7 kids. Well then, Phoenix waggled a finger at himself and Marcus. He'll be glad to know it's gone. We killed it. Once Truda translated, the old man laughed again, this time with joy. He bent his wiry body in a bow toward both warriors and rattled off a series of sentences. Everyone looked at Truda. She frowned. He says the village is grateful, and he's sorry we've been put in here. He's going to speak to the Firmother, the chieftain, about getting us out. Turning back to the older man, she asked him a question. It's about time, Phoenix murmured. Jade nodded. Truda spoke over the top of their soft exchange. He says his name is Asulfur. Jade leaned over and whispered to Phoenix. We'd better introduce ourselves. You do it. Phoenix shrugged again. He introduced them by the simple means of pointing to each person and naming them. Marcus bowed his head. Bryn gave a small wave. Truda smiled chirpily. He introduced Jade last. She pushed back her fur hood and nodded. Asulfur stopped in mid-greeting, staring at her, apparently hypnotized. Lyo Salfar. He breathed the word reverently, as though Jade were something he had never seen and never expected to see. Jade looked at Truda for a translation. The girl was also staring at her strangely, as though she'd suddenly understood something important and wasn't quite sure she liked it. It means light elf, she said in a wondering tone. You are, aren't you? I hadn't really thought about it until now, but that's what you are. One of the light elves. What's a light elf? Jade asked sharply, once again not sure if it was a good or bad thing. They live in Alfheim near Asgard, under the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree I was telling you about, Truda explained. She frowned up at the old Sphere man. He kept staring at Jade with awed admiration. The light elves don't come to Midgard very much, so I think he's a little surprised. Even I've only seen them a few times, when they take Pa along on the wild hunt. Jade laughed uneasily. What would he say if he knew who you are? Truda shrugged. Not much. My pa and the other gods are always turning up in Midgard, so the people are used to us. They never see the Ljósálfar. There was a hint of resentment in her voice, and Jade wondered if the godchild were jealous. She was probably used to being the center of attention with the druids. Just then, Ásólfr made a sound of extreme frustration. He had been peering at their faces, obviously trying to follow their conversation. Now, he climbed stiffly to his feet. The companions did the same, not sure what to expect. He raised gnarled hands, fingers flat and splayed. In a low, gentle voice, he began to chant. Jade felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise up. Flickers of purple-blue danced around the old man, gathering in strength as his voice grew louder. His body shook. The long ash staff jumped from the floor to his hand of its own accord. Bryn yelped. Marcus stepped in front of Jade, pushing her and Bryn back toward the wall. Phoenix did the same for Truda. There was nowhere to go, no place to avoid the buildup of magic in the tiny hut. Desperately, Jade tried to create a shield strong enough to deflect the old man's magic, but the after effects of the lily weakened her powers when he finally released the spell. Her thin safeguard shattered into 1,000 invisible, purple-blue shards. She flinched, feeling its destruction a fraction before the enchantment struck. When it hit, Jade felt almost nothing. She had been expecting pain or death. Judging by the wary, incredulous looks on her friends' faces, they had thought the same. Instead, she felt a peculiar sense of twisting inside her head. It was as though someone was fiddling around in her brain, tweaking it and altering it somehow. Then the sensation disappeared, but she felt no different. Pushing past Marcus, she marched up to the old man. This was no time to worry about social protocols. She had to know what he had done to her mind. "What did you do to us?" she demanded. Ásólfr raised one bushy brow, his blue eyes twinkling down at her. "I simply made it possible for us to understand one another." Jade blinked at him, and blinked again as she realized she'd understood every word. "But how?" she stammered. The others looked equally dumbfounded, except Truda, who sulked. The old man bowed. "I placed the ability to understand all languages into your minds. You will never again have this problem." "But why?" She stared at him. "Why didn't you just do it to yourself instead? Why give us this gift?" "Alas," he spread his hands regretfully, "I cannot perform even the simplest magic on myself, only on others. It is the limitation of my form of power." Feeling a little shell-shocked, she hastened to thank him. Thank you. It will help us immensely in the future. You are most welcome, my lady. It is a small repayment for the service you have done our humble village." He inclined his gray head. Jade smiled and blushed. "I don't think I rate being called my lady, Master Lifebringer. Please just call me Jade." "You may call me Ásólfr." The old man bowed. As he straightened, he grimaced and placed a hand in the small of his back. Jade moved to help him, but he waved her away. "One of the many joys of old age, I'm afraid. There is nothing that can be done. Now," he pulled the ugly wolf head up again, "we must talk to the chieftain about getting you out. This is not the place to house troll slayers and a lady of the light elves." He glanced distastefully around the tiny, dirty hut. 20 minutes later, the group had moved into a guesting house of positively luxurious standard compared to their last accommodation. Their spare clothing already awaited them, laid out on the low beds. Jade was overjoyed to find there was even a sauna and standing bathroom. She instantly dragged Truda into the little rooms and proceeded to sweat, steam, and slosh the dirt and filth of the last week off. It felt so good to be clean. Afterward, she changed into her spare set of clothes and made Truda put on her druid robe again. Then she attacked their clothes and scrubbed them clean as best she could in the standing tub. Finally, she hung them out to dry, on a line obviously placed in the room for that purpose. Emerging from the bathrooms over an hour after they'd entered, Jade sighed and fluffed out her long, clean hair. Now she felt like a person again. Marcus and Phoenix had to drag Bryn, protesting and yelling, into the facilities. When the boys were gone, a soft knock fell on the door. It opened and a young girl about Truda's age came in carrying a tray of food. Behind her came several larger boys and girls, all carrying either foods, drinks, new clothing, and best of all, their confiscated weapons and the rest of their bags. They stared openly at her, whispering and nudging each other. Jade thanked them, desperate for them to leave. She needed to check on their gear. Was the Hylian Bagya still there? Her herbs, her knife. As soon as the door closed, Jade snatched up her pack and searched it. Sighing deeply, she drew out the ruby-hilted knife and the slippery black bag and hugged them to her chest. Inside the bag rested the magic horn Orphanon had given her. She really needed to keep it closer to hand. Twice now, she could have used it to summon help. If she'd had her wits about her last night, she could have simply blown it to combat the troll. Obviously, Phoenix hadn't remembered it either, or he wouldn't have had to dash off and rescue Marcus. Everything else seemed to be there, too. Relieved, she and Truda inspected the new clothes. 2 long skirts she put aside as being too impractical for travel. Luckily, there were enough trousers and sturdy shirts for all 5 companions to have at least 2 changes of clothes from now on. How wonderful! Jade had never really appreciated the delights of clean clothes and clean skin until now. She must remember to thank her mother for doing so much laundry when she got home. If she got home. Not long after, all 3 boys emerged, Bryn still grumbling over his enforced cleanliness. His dark hair stuck out at odd angles, reminding Jade of a wet, very irritated kitten. Asulfur knocked on the door, interrupting Bryn's complaints. Behind him was a small boy carrying another bundle. Asulfur bowed and smiled. "There is to be a feast in your honor. You are to meet our lord, Hrothgar." Jade glanced at Phoenix, who frowned a little. He and Marcus still looked like death warmed up. A feast was probably not what they really needed. "That's very kind." She smiled at the old man. "But we are very tired. Please don't go to any trouble for us." Asulfur shook his white head. "There has been little enough to celebrate this winter. It has been long and hard. Even now, spring hides her head from us and refuses to melt the snows. If it lasts much longer, we will not be able to plant crops. All the more reason to husband your remaining food wisely," Marcus murmured. The old man sighed. "Indeed, but Hrothgar will not be swayed. He feels the news of the troll's death must be an omen and should be celebrated. The gods must be thanked for sending you to us. Come." He nodded toward Jade. "I'm afraid that your attire is not appropriate, my lady. You must meet the chieftain. He will not appreciate your manly garb. Please put this on." He handed the cloth the boy carried to Jade. "It is a gift from the queen and is far more fitting for a lady of the light elves." Bowing slightly, he turned to go. "I will return to escort you to the Verki, the chieftain's stronghold." After he left, the 5 companions looked at each other. Jade frowned thoughtfully at Truda. "So if we don't get you back to Asgard quickly, these people will starve?" she asked the girl. Truda nodded solemnly. "These people and all the others caught in the snows of winter. I must get back to make spring come. And soon." she said, twisting her hands together. Jade sighed. Well, I guess we'd better go to this feast and thank the gods or whatever. Maybe they'll even hear us and take us straight to your parents. That would save a lot of mucking about. Phoenix grinned at her. I like the sound of a feast, but I don't like your chances of getting any shortcuts to the end of the quest. Skipping the fun bits is not how it works here. Jade snorted. Fun bits? You're a nut, you are. That last fun bit almost got you killed again. She turned away, shook out the gown, and gasped in delight. Far from the coarse woven cloths of the peasants, this was of the softest, finest wool, colored a deep forest green and embroidered across the breast, hem and long sleeves with silver thread. It was a dress fit for a queen, indeed. Jade held it up admiringly. She couldn't hide a small smile at the thought of wearing something so beautiful. In her real-world family, all her clothes were 3 times hand-me-downs, worn and tired. Even as a tomboy child, she'd longed for something better. She turned around to show Truda, only to find the others all staring at her. Their expressions ranged from Marcus's mild frown to Truda's outright sulk. What? She asked, worried. Phoenix raised an eyebrow. Getting the special treatment, are you? He gave her a mocking bow. My lady of the light elves. Jade felt a flash of hurt and pressed her lips together to hide it. She gave an irritated, one-shouldered shrug. I don't care about it, if that's what you mean. If I play along, we'll probably get better help. Besides, I am an elf, and that's obviously something special to these people. Truda gasped. Her blue eyes widened, then narrowed in anger. She huffed at Jade, folded her arms, and stomped away. Jade sighed at the young girl's temper. Phoenix gazed after Truda, then turned a cynical expression on Jade. That was uncalled for. She's a kid. You don't have to make her feel bad just to make yourself feel better. She's important, too, hurt and guilty. Jade turned away to hide the quick rush of tears that stung her eyes. Chapter 11. It was a silent, tense group that followed Asulfur from the guest lodge, with Jade clearly still smarting at Phoenix's comment. Truda sulking over Jade's special treatment and Phoenix annoyed at both of them. Marcus looked grimmer than usual and Bryn stayed uncharacteristically silent, his dark, worried eyes darting between Phoenix and Jade. They walked for almost 10 minutes up a steep incline behind the village. Darkness slipped in to replace dusk, so it was only when they had almost reached the top that Phoenix realized what they were climbing. An enormous, man-made, fortified hilltop. At the end of the path, a great ditch encircled the top of the hill. Behind it was an earth embankment topped by a tall palisade, a massive wooden wall made of sharpened logs. A stone causeway led to a timber gate, guarded by 2 large blonde warriors. They nodded to Asulfur, and the gate swung outward to admit the party. Inside, flaming torches lit their path, marching straight toward a huge timber hall that had to be the chieftain's place. From within, they could hear the sound of male voices talking and laughing, dogs growling, and the faint, regular thump of a drum. When the door opened, Phoenix blinked in surprise. The great hall was massive and full of people. Down either side of the rectangular room ran rough wooden tables and benches lined with dozens of hulking warriors. Little bowls filled with burning oil-soaked reeds, rushlights, cast a mellow, flickering light on the faces of everyone present. A large fire crackled in a central hearth, the smoke rising up to seep out through the thatched roof. Huge, round wood and iron shields hung along the walls. At the far end was a head table, slightly raised on a dais. Seated there were 3 men and 1 woman. Asulfur thumped the end of his staff on the packed earth floor 3 times. My lord Hrothgar, builder of the great hall of Heorot, ruler over Svealand. He bowed deeply to the silver-haired giant of a man at the head table. "I bring the strangers before you." Waving them forward, he introduced them one at a time. Bryn, Elun's son of the Bretons. Bryn stepped to the front, bowed jerkily, then retreated behind the others. Marcus Gnaeus Agricola, troll slayer, and son of Gnaeus Julius Agricola, governor of Britain for the mighty Roman Empire. Marcus bowed. His face was blank, but Phoenix could see his jaw working as he heard his father's name linked with his own. Phoenix took a moment to wonder how the old magician knew so much about them, and whether such knowledge was a potential threat. Thruder, Thor's daughter, goddess of spring. Truda curtsied regally as the buzz of talk amongst the assembled warriors increased. The child looked extremely pleased at the excitement her name had generated. "Phoenix Drake Carter, Troll Slayer." The old man's voice was exultant as he gave the title. Phoenix felt himself flushing in embarrassment as spontaneous applause broke out amongst the men. He bowed awkwardly and stepped back. It was ridiculous to feel so thrilled by impressing a bunch of barbarians he didn't even know. But he couldn't help the surge of pride he felt as they all gazed at him in admiration. No one except his mother had ever been impressed by him before. And hey, that was her job. And Asulfur waved Jade forward. Jade, daughter of Ileri, Lady of the Light Elves. She stepped up and removed the long fur coat she'd worn over her dress. There was a collective gasp from the audience. Phoenix looked at her critically, but had to admit she was worth gasping over. Her pale skin was clean now, and the green dress matched her eyes perfectly. Long silver blonde hair rippled down her back. She was beautiful, haughty, queenly. Phoenix gritted his teeth and glanced at Truda. Sure enough, the young girl's mouth was set in a mulish expression of anger and hurt. If Jade weren't careful, she would alienate the young goddess and make their journey much, much harder. The old man led them around one side of the hall. Heads turned as they passed. Whispered comments were made. Laughs followed. Phoenix chose to ignore them. He laid a hand on Bryn's shoulder when the boy opened his mouth to reply hotly to a less than polite comment. Leaning down, he murmured, "We're outnumbered 10-1, Bryn. Don't start anything." Startled, the boy looked around. He was obviously noticing what Phoenix had spotted the moment they walked in the room. Every man in the place was armed with a dagger and built like an Olympic weightlifter. Between the 5 of them, they had a bow with no arrows, a quarterstaff, 1 sword, a sling, and 4 daggers. Unfortunately, they'd been forced to leave all but the daggers outside the hall. Weapons were not allowed on the king's presence. Out of the corner of his eye, Phoenix saw Marcus lean forward and mutter something into Jade's ear. She looked briefly startled, glanced around the room, then nodded. Her eyes narrowed and mouth firmed. Good. At least Marcus had jolted her out of dreamy princess land. He'd been worried that she was going to drop her guard just because they'd given her a pretty dress and a flowery introduction. So far, these people of Ol-Shamar had not yet shown any overwhelming reasons to trust them. Dinner passed jovially enough. They were seated at the high table. Phoenix, Marcus, and Bryn sat on King Hrothgar's right. Jade and Truda on his left, beside his queen, Welctheo. Food arrived, and the companions ate the best meal they'd had for days. Roast auerhun, roast boar, and salted fish were the main ingredients, but there were all sorts of root vegetables and breads, as well as a few dried fruits. The last winter stocks of summer gathering. It was worrying to think that this might be the last of their stores, though. Truda had to get to Asgard. While the meal progressed, There was little talk between the king and his guests. Everyone seemed more interested in eating, much to Phoenix's relief. He had no idea what to say to a king. Jade didn't seem to have the same problem. She and the queen chatted away like old friends. Thankfully, they seemed to be including Truda in their conversation. The girl looked happier anyway. All too soon, the food scraps were cleared, either tossed to dogs scavenging around the floor or taken back to the kitchens by serving women. King Hrothgar leaned back in his high wooden chair and slewed around to stare at Phoenix with piercing blue eyes. He stroked his beard, eyeing the young man shrewdly. "So, my young hero, you are the troll slayer? Tell us the story, then," he demanded. Other warriors nearby took up the request, yelling, "Story, story," until the whole lot were chanting it, and the rafters shook with the sound. Phoenix gulped. He hated public speaking. In fact, hated was an understatement. He'd been known to skip school just to avoid having to speak in front of the class. He looked toward Marcus. The Roman's eyes widened and he shook his head with a half-smile, clearly refusing to do the job. Phoenix understood. If he were bad with words, Marcus was surely worse. He seemed to have a 50-word-per-day limit. Glancing to his left, Phoenix saw Jade scowling at him. "Go on," she mouthed, jerking her head at the impatient mob before them. There didn't seem to be any option. He could hardly refuse. The palms of his hands began to sweat as he began to push his chair back. His heart pounded in his ears, and his stomach felt like it was about to violently eject his dinner. Dozens of expectant faces turned toward him. He swallowed hard, his mind a complete blank. "My lords, ladies and good thanes," Bryn's voice cut through the babble, rescuing Phoenix from one of his worst nightmares. Phoenix looked over at the boy in surprise. Bryn sent him a cheeky wink before jumping onto the high table in one lithe bound. The boy put his wooden recorder-like pipe to his lips with a flourish and blew an intricate run of pure notes. Silenced, the audience turned their attention to him. By my lord's and Phoenix's leave, Bryn bowed to Phoenix and then to the king. I shall tell the tale of high adventure that occurred just one day ago. He blew another quick tune, this one seeming somehow haunting rather than joyful. Astonished, Phoenix stared at him. With a relieved sigh, he nodded to the Breton boy and relaxed. Whew, he was off the hook. For 20 minutes, Bryn held the Svealanders enthralled, alternating between music, cavorting reenactments with the pipe substituting for a sword or torch, and thrilling, hypnotic words. He kept fairly close to the real story, but there were a few embellishments here and there. It all sounded a lot more gripping than terrifying. There also seemed to be quite a few more cliffhanger moments than Phoenix remembered. The audience loved it. They cheered the successes and gasped at near escapes. He just hoped nobody asked him for his version. It was much less exciting than Bryn's. The boy was a born storyteller. Embarrassed, Phoenix exchanged rueful glances with Marcus as the hall erupted into thunderous applause. Hrothgar pounded the wooden table with a stein, calling for silence. "Truly, you have done us a great honor this day, boy." Hrothgar flicked Bryn something, and the boy caught it deftly, bowing his gratitude. "You are a princely Sagatala, lad. Anytime you wish to cease your journeying and join my court, you will be welcome." Bryn bowed again. "I thank you, my lord. But the true heroes of this day are my lords, troll slayers." He gave one last, triumphantly joyous run of notes on his whistle, then scooted back to his seat, flushed and starry-eyed. Phoenix leaned past Marcus and gripped the boy's shoulder. "Totally amazing, Bryn. I had no idea you could do that." "Me neither," he grinned. "But you should have seen the look of terror on your face when he asked you. I figure if you can kill trolls, this is the least I can do to contribute." Phoenix laughed. "Thanks. I know which one I'd rather do." The king spoke again, addressing the whole room in his deep, rich voice. "These strangers have done our village a great service. We must reward them suitably, for they have destroyed the troll, Grendel, which has plagued our people for 2 long years. Surely it is an omen that spring will come, and our land will once again be rich, fertile, and free from fear." He had to wait a few moments for a fresh wave of cheers to die down. Phoenix snuck a look at Jade, wondering what she thought of all this, whether she resented being left out of the recognition. He saw an expression of astonished horror on her face that sent a chill down his back. He looked around, expecting to see invaders, minions of Judai, Roman soldiers, something to justify that face. The room seemed normal. Well, normal for a hall full of half-drunk, mead-quaffing, sword-waving barbarian warriors. Hrothgar continued, and Phoenix had to quit trying to catch Jade's eye. Whatever was bothering her would have to wait until they were back in the guest house. Phoenix Carter and Marcus Agricola approach. Hrothgar summoned them. Hesitantly, they moved to stand before the imposing figure. Hrothgar stood and placed a hand on a shoulder of each. "It is difficult to know what reward to give you, for there is little that can compare to the freedom you have bestowed upon my people. Ask what you will, and if it can be done, I will give it to you. What would you?" The king winked. "My daughter's hand." There was a faint, startled protest from his queen. "A place at my side, as sons and heirs to my kingdom." This time, there was a low muttering from several warriors at the top of one of the long tables. The queen gasped. Phoenix guessed that neither of these choices would be popular, so it was a good thing he wasn't interested in either marrying or becoming a sphere prince. He thought for a moment. "My lord," he bowed, trying to find the right words. "We are on a great journey, so alas, we cannot stay in your fair land." A relieved sigh came from several nearby people. Phoenix suppressed a smile. "However, if you would be kind enough to give us fresh supplies, perhaps horses, a sword for Marcus, and directions to Uppsala, we would consider ourselves amply repaid." All up, he was quite pleased with that speech. It sounded humbly regretful and grateful, while at the same time getting them what they needed to continue their trip. This time, when he looked up, Jade was smiling at him. She nodded a little and gave him a tiny thumbs-up signal. There was still a faint, worried look around her eyes that said she knew something she wasn't happy about, though. Hrothgar hesitated, then inclined his head in agreement. "You shall have that and more, my young friend. Gifts will be prepared and delivered to your quarters in the morning, but surely you will stay in Heorot a few more days and enjoy our hospitality." There was nothing Phoenix would have liked better than to stay and be pampered and fed for a few more days. Well, almost nothing. He didn't need Jade's quick frown or Truda's scowling, pouty look to remind him of the tight schedule they were on to get Truda home. Ragnarok had to be prevented, and it seemed they were the only ones who could do it. So he expressed suitable apologies to the king and tried to pretend he was pleased to be going off into the unknown to die a few more times. Well, at least he still had 5 more times he could die. He'd managed to avoid being killed by the troll, and was perfectly happy to avoid being killed by anything for as long as possible. The celebration finally dribbled to a halt at around midnight, when the last of the king's thanes and warriors drank themselves into oblivion under the tables. The worst part, Phoenix decided, was how truly awful their singing became as the evening progressed. There seemed to be a direct connection with their inability to stay in tune, and the amount of mead consumed. The poor court musician's ears must have been bleeding. Jade had long since taken Truda and Bryn off to bed. Marcus and Phoenix only stayed because Hrothgar insisted. Somehow they managed to stay fairly sober by tipping more mead and ale onto the floor than into their mouths. The dogs were now staggering about, howling drunk, but at least Marcus and Phoenix weren't. By the time they picked their way through the sprawled, snoring bodies and down the hill to the guest hall, they were completely exhausted. Phoenix was looking forward to a decent sleep, in a bed for once. His luck was out. The minute they pushed the door open, Jade pounced on them. She had changed back into traveling gear. Her expression said she'd been pacing the room anxiously and had something important to say. Phoenix groaned. "Not now, Jade. I'm totally wrecked. Can't this wait until morning?" "Shh," Jade hissed. "Don't wake the others." She glanced over her shoulder at Bryn and Truda's blanketed forms. Clutching at Phoenix and Marcus's arms, she dragged them into a corner. "No, it can't wait until morning." "Why not?" Phoenix yawned. She was being very dramatic. "What can possibly happen between midnight and morning?" "You don't understand," she said fiercely. "You are Beowulf." He stared at her blearily, having no clue at all what she was talking about. Tired of the drama, he said so. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Jade. I'm Phoenix, remember? Phoenix. He patted her arm. "It's been a long day. You're tired. Get some sleep and you'll be fine in the morning." "Ah, you moron!" Jade thumped his chest. "Don't patronize me, just because you don't read books. Beowulf is the hero in a story." "So?" Phoenix yawned again. Marcus began removing his outer furs and boots, having wisely decided to stay out of it. "So?" She took a deep breath, visibly trying to calm herself. Beowulf killed Grendel the Troll in the Old Norse story of Beowulf. Grendel had been terrorizing King Hrothgar, his wife Velkthiau, his hall Heorot, and his people. See, everything fits. He raised his eyebrows in an effort to seem amazed. "Huh. Well, what do you know? So the programmers wrote an old story into this world. Cool. So what? We did kill Grendel. Story over." She threw up her hands in frustration, somehow managing to yell in a whisper. Grendel had a mother. A big, fat, angry mother troll who came to take revenge on Beowulf for her son's death. Chapter 12. Marcus dropped a boot onto the floor with a thud that seemed loud in the silence following Jade's words. She glared at Phoenix. Surely he understood the danger they were in now. "Ah," he expelled the word on a sigh. "So you're saying there's another one of those walking mountains out there?" Jade nodded. It was hard to stay calm when he was being so stupidly relaxed about it. She wanted to thump him on the head to try and get the idea into his skull. Honestly, Phoenix ran a hand through his long dark hair and scratched his scalp. "So will it come after us like right now?" He cast a longing glance at an empty bed. She bit her lip. She'd never read the original Norse poem, only a Rosemary Sutcliffe book based on the 1500-year-old saga, so she couldn't say exactly when Grendel's mother was supposed to attack Hrothgar's hall. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Excellent." Phoenix arched in a bone-cracking stretch. "How about you stay up for this first watch, just in case? Marcus and I will get some more sleep. That way," he waved a hand, "we'll be ready to give Mother Troll the runaround as well." "Well," she hesitated. Glancing at Marcus's face, she saw he and Phoenix both had heavy dark circles beneath their eyes. They needed sleep. She felt another twinge of guilt for letting them bear the burden of defeating Grendel. She owed them. "Okay," she sighed. "You sleep. I'll keep watch, but..." Phoenix slapped her on the back, making her cough. "Don't stress. I'm sure we'll have at least one night's grace." Famous last words, Jade muttered. She moved to station herself beside the front door, opening it a fraction so she could see the moonlit village outside. In the long hours that followed, she wondered how much more she could take. The strain of actually living this adventure was starting to wear her down. She really needed to get a grip. This game was challenging, everything she once thought she actually might be good at. She'd always daydreamed about how perfect she'd be if she were thrown into this sort of fantasy land. Always imagined being a brave warrior princess. Her initial fears about not being able to cope in this game were being played out. She was making mistakes. Lots of them. It was terrifying. Not surprisingly, this thought did nothing to improve her confidence. Jade spent the night with her hand clenched on her quarterstaff, eyes on the door, head awhirl with confused, worried thoughts and doubts. In spite of her fear, the night passed peacefully. Everyone, except her, slept soundly until sunrise. Jade let them all rest the night through. As a half-elf, she could go longer without sleep than humans. She was a little tired, but she knew she could cope until the next night. At dawn, she roused them all and started the packing. The morning had brought a little composure to her thinking. At least, she was able to plan for their next trip. That was something, anyway. The other doubts she pushed aside, not yet ready to deal with them. She had to focus on getting true to home in time to stop Ragnarok. That was the most important thing now. Carefully, she stowed a small amount of gear into each backpack, then shoved the bulk of their new clothes into the Hylian Bagia. For extra security, she asked Bryn to also remember the name of each item she stuffed into the magic bag. To get things back out of the bag, you had to give it the correct name, like bear fur coat or javelin. There was no point in having a bag full of things nobody could get out. Who knew what was already in there? In his more treasure-hungry moments, Bryn tried random words. Generalities like gold or silver didn't seem to work. His more specific, frustrated attempts had so far produced only a chair, a bolt of coarse cloth, and 5 pairs of baby shoes. He often repeated his suggestion that they cut it open and see what came out. A servant brought breakfast of thick porridge, laced with honey, which they ate quickly. A polite knock fell on the door. Asulfur's aged voice called to them. "My friends, King Hrothgar and his lady await you without. They bring gifts and wish to give you a good farewell." The 5 companions stepped out into brilliant spring sunshine, blinking. Arrayed before them were 5 sturdy horses, 3 for riding, and 2 loaded with stuffed provisions bags. King Hrothgar himself came forward carrying 2 swords. The first, a long sword, he handed to Marcus with a warning to use it well. Marcus swung it, obviously feeling the difference between it and the shorter gladius he was used to. "It is made of the best steel by the best craftsman in the world. You will not find a better sword, except perhaps this one." Hrothgar handed the second over to Phoenix with a look of pride and regret. "It was given to me by Thor himself. I don't really want to part with it, but I'm getting too old to do it justice. Now I have found a hero worthy of it." The older man pushed the sword away as Phoenix automatically tried to return it. "No. You keep it, but use it wisely. Its name is Blodbal. It means blood fire." Hrothgar drew a breath and released it on a sigh. There is power in this weapon for one who can use it with a clear head. However, if you use it in blind hatred or anger, that power will consume you, and you will become a berserker. The old king raised a warning finger. "You will not know friend from foe, and you will not stop until all are dead around you. So be careful, my young hero. Of course, it doesn't work on trolls, or I would have used it years ago." Phoenix stared at the weapon, clearly more than a little excited by the idea of wielding a magic sword. He drew it from its worn leather scabbard. It was exquisite. There was nothing flashy or fancy. No jewels or goldwork in the hilt. Just a plain, leather-wrapped grip and metal crosspiece below a long, broad blade. The blade did not have the high polish that Marcus's new one did, but it looked sharp and well-kept. He swung it experimentally. "Wow," he murmured, catching Jade's skeptical look. "It's like I don't even have to think. It just knows what I want to do next." Bemusement flickered over his face, and he looked away into the distance, as though he heard something no one else could. Then his eyes refocused, and he blinked at Hrothgar. "It's singing to me. Is it supposed to do that?" Hrothgar roared a laugh and slapped Phoenix on the shoulder, making him stagger. "That means it likes you, boy. It's getting the damn thing to stop singing, that's the challenge." Phoenix turned to show the others. Bryn touched the flat of the blade hesitantly, as though expecting it to shock him. Jade inspected it in a different way, looking for any signs of magic. There it was. When she looked at it right, the whole sword positively glowed and pulsed with the telltale purple-blue aura that indicated a powerful magical tool. "Magic," Phoenix murmured. She nodded, a little worried. "Quite strong, too. Be careful with that thing." Phoenix resheathed Blodball and strapped it onto his left hip. After a moment's hesitation, he presented his own, shorter sword to Bryn. The boy took it reverently and tied it to his hip. He walked with a definite swagger. Jade made a mental note to ask Phoenix to teach him how to use it before he accidentally cut his own leg off. Hrothgar presented still more gifts. Jade watched, feeling guilty and worried. She hoped he wouldn't give her anything. She hadn't done anything to earn gifts. Besides, if Grendel's mother came, they would have accepted them under false pretenses. To Marcus, he gave a quiver full of new iron-tipped arrows. Phoenix received a small round shield to replace his own, lost in Stonehenge. To Bryn, the king gave a whistle made of bronze. Its pure, clear notes sounded out across the village as the boy piped his joy. Truda received a gown of blue to match Jade's green one, a bracelet of bronze, and a small iron dagger. The girl was delighted and hugged the old king. His lined face softened into a smile, and he patted the child's head. When it came to Jade, he beckoned Asulfur forward. The old magician came stiffly up, holding a slender, leather-bound book in his hands. He stroked the cover reverently once, then handed it to Jade. She accepted, but protested that she didn't need anything but the gift of languages he had already given them. "Lady," Asulfur said with a smile, "you have made my long life complete just by your arrival in our village. You and your companions will be remembered in saga songs for generations to come. This," he tapped the book with his finger, "is a copy of my research, spells and enchantments that might help you in your travels." Jade gasped, awed. "This is too much. I can't take this." He laughed softly. "It's only a copy. I still have the original. Besides," he patted her hand, "everyone's magic is personal. My spells may not even work for you." She gazed at the old man and suddenly missed her father terribly. He was the only other person who ever treated her as special and important. Asulfur had given her an incredibly valuable gift: trust. Trust that she would not misuse his spells for dark purposes. Trust that she would keep his knowledge to herself. Trust that she was a good person in the depths of her heart. Jade vowed not to let him down. Following Truda's example, she hugged the old magician. As she did so, her healer self sensed the aches and pains of arthritis in his joints. He was not really so old after all, but the pain of the disease had aged him. Well, she could do something about that. Rummaging about in her backpack, Jade brought out her herb bag and extracted a few dried juniper leaves from it. She poured a few drops of water from her water skin into the palm of her hand and mushed the leaves into a paste. Next she drew Asulfur aside from the throng of people, seeing the companions off. "Will you let me help you once more?" she asked him. The old man frowned at her. "How? You said you couldn't do magic on yourself?" He shook his head. "Let me ease your pain." Jade smiled at the flicker of hope in his eyes. He nodded hesitantly. She dabbed a little of the herb paste onto his forehead and hands, then took his twisted fingers in her own and closed her eyes. A few soft, elven words spoken under her breath, a surge of power that tasted like copper and juniper in her mouth, the flicker of purple-blue energy behind her eyelids, and it was done. Smiling in satisfaction, Jade let go of the Lifebringer's hands and stepped back. Asulfur stared at her. He straightened up slowly. A look of pure joy and amazement flowered on his wrinkled face. With an exultant laugh, he executed a funny little dance step on the spot. He gazed at her wonderingly, then bowed. "I have no way to thank you. You have changed my life." Jade blushed and shook her head. "I'm glad I could help." But she drew him further aside. Glancing around to make sure nobody overheard, she decided to warn the old magician. "Please be careful." "What of?" Asulfur flexed his fingers, admiring the way they moved. "I'm sure that Grendel was not alone," she whispered. The old man's eyes jumped to hers, his white brows snapping together in a frown. "What makes you say that? In all the years Grendel terrorized our people, he did so alone." Jade bit her lip. How could she say she'd read it in a story? It would sound ridiculous. Finally, she decided she'd have to tell a small lie and hope he couldn't read her very well. She'd always been able to fool her family. She reached up and tapped her temple with one finger. "My elven senses warned me about Grendel, and now I feel the presence of another. It is angry. I'm worried it may take revenge on Ulshamar for Grendel's death. Please." She laid a hand on Asulfur's sleeve. "Warn Hrothgar to be wary." Asulfur stared at her in horror for a moment, then shook himself and nodded. "Thank you for your warning. I shall pass it on to the king." He opened his mouth, then shut it with a regretful look. "I cannot ask you and your friends to stay when you have already done so much. You have your own quest to pursue. Now that we know a troll can be killed, we will be able to do it ourselves if we must. Go with our thanks, Jade. Be safe." He held her shoulders and placed a light, whiskery kiss on her cheek. Jade hugged him again and moved back to the others with a heavier burden of guilt. It was her fault that Phoenix and Marcus had taken on the troll alone. Her fault that Grendel's death was now putting Asulfur and his people in danger. She just couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. Chapter 13. Jade's strangled gasp of fear made Phoenix look sharply around. They were only a few minutes outside the village, and he was already wondering where and when the next attack would come. Blodball leapt to his hand before he thought about it. He twisted about, trying to find the source of her sudden exclamation of shock. There was nothing. As he looked a question at her, she leaned forward, clinging to the mane of her horse. The mare, startled by her rider's fear, tossed her head nervously and trotted for a few jarring steps. Jade buried her face in the horse's neck and held on. Phoenix reined his own mount in and leaned over to grab the back of her coat. Truda, who was sitting behind him with her arms wrapped around his waist, squeaked and grabbed tighter. "What on earth are you doing?" he demanded, hauling Jade upright. 2 minutes ago, Marcus and I were just talking about what a good rider you are. What's the deal? Her knuckles were white on the reins. She stared around at him. "I can ride," Duh, he said sarcastically. It's what you've been doing perfectly well for the last 15 minutes. Why did you suddenly decide you couldn't? Oh. He realized, a little late, that Jade from the real world must not be able to ride. But Jade Ganeleri obviously could, as long as 13-year-old Jade had let her avatar have control. She'd been fine. Once she'd actually thought about what was going on, she'd freaked. Phoenix sighed. When this whole weird adventure began, Jade had been a very reluctant heroine. But heroine she undoubtedly was. After her initial doubts, she'd coped beautifully with magic. Romans, dryads, and druids. Now she was falling apart, and Phoenix had no idea why. It might have something to do with how badly she'd been overwhelmed by the presence of the troll, and how stupid she'd been to eat the lily leaves. It had shaken her confidence, and now she was second-guessing herself. He did know that if she didn't get herself together pretty fast, they were stuffed. In this land of magic and gods, they needed someone like her. Someone who understood the supernatural and who'd read a lot of stupid fantasy adventure novels. He knew computer games and fighting. She knew the books they were based on. Jade. He tried for patience but managed slight sarcasm. Get a grip, would you? You might not think you can ride, but you can. He frowned at her, trying to get the message across without prompting awkward questions from Truda. Relax, you'll be fine. He kneed his horse and hers followed his. She sent him a quick, worried look before closing her eyes. Phoenix watched as she took a long, deep breath and released it. Her whole body relaxed and she sat back in the saddle like a seasoned rider. He nodded in satisfaction. Didn't you tell me your uncle owned a farm? He commented, finally assured she wasn't going to fall off. A dairy farm, she replied tartly. I can ride a motorbike without a problem, thanks. Phoenix grinned. Well, just think of the horse as an old-fashioned kind of motorbike. A bit bumpier and more temperamental, that's all. Helpful, Jade shot back, but she smiled a little. The three were silent a while, watching Marcus, who rode ahead with Bryn clinging on for dear life behind. Marcus rode as if he was born in the saddle, which was not surprising, considering how many years he had followed his father around the Roman Empire. Bryn, however, rode badly. The boy's thin legs stuck out stiffly over the stallion's round belly, and he winced at every bump and jolt. The pockets of his new clothing bulged, and Phoenix briefly wondered how he could diplomatically ask the boy what he'd stolen from the village. After a moment's thought, he decided not to ask at all. He was better off not knowing. From the corner of his eye, Phoenix watched as Jade slipped back into deep thought and chewed her lower lip. Something was really bugging her. Eventually, she sent him a troubled look. Do you think we did the right thing, leaving them like that? Mindful of Truda's curious ears right behind, he shrugged. Who knows? From a player's point of view, yes. We did what we were obviously supposed to do there, and we have to keep moving. Anything more would have been just bonus points. Remember where we are? She sighed. I just don't feel good about it. I know it wouldn't have got us any closer to Asgard, but it seems wrong to leave them and not know if they'll be okay. It doesn't feel like the right thing to do. Phoenix frowned, hearing an echo of his father's words. He shifted uneasily in the saddle. If he'd just been playing this game on the outside, he definitely would have stayed. On the outside, these decisions were easy. You fought the bad guys, collected points, treasure, and weapons along the way, and eventually either got killed or you killed the big bad guy to win the game. In fact, he probably would have gone looking for Grendel's mother, just for the bonus points and possible treasure. Being in the game, though, added an extra layer to every decision. It wasn't just his life on the line, and As much fun as all these adventures were, it was always in the back of his mind that Jade didn't really want to be here. Marcus and Bryn were part of the team too, and he had finally come to realize that he couldn't justify putting them in danger just to chase some extra experience points or treasure they didn't need. No, they were better off on the move than waiting to get trumped by another troll for absolutely no gain. His job was to get Truda back home and prevent Ragnarok. "I know what you mean," he finally said, "but we don't even know for sure if this matches up with Beowulf. Keep in mind the quest we're on. We can't get sidetracked. Who knows, maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe the..." He hesitated, glancing at Truda's wide blue eyes over his shoulder. "Powers that control this world, just like the same sort of stories you do. Maybe it's no big deal to them," he said. "You know how easily amused those geeks are." That was a word that shouldn't translate, he thought. Jade stared at him for a second, then nodded with obvious reluctance. "I suppose." After a few minutes, she shook herself and made an effort to be her old self again. Phoenix breathed a soft sigh of relief. She wasn't quite back to normal, but at least she wasn't sunk in depression. He just hoped to goodness nothing bad happened to old Shamar. If it did, she'd be sure to blame herself and he'd never hear the end of it. They didn't discuss it any further, and the day passed without incident. Hrothgar's directions had them traveling northeast. They aimed to be at Orebro, a large town about 50 kilometers away, on the shore of a lake called Hjalmaren. However, because of their late start, the shortness of the northern spring days and the slow pace of the pack horses, they had not yet reached their goal when night swept in. As dusk turned everything softly gray, the companions slipped stiffly down from their mounts and led them off the narrow road. To the east was yet another of the many small lakes and ponds that dotted this area. Nearby, they found a small thicket of saplings growing in a rough circle. It seemed like a good place to set up camp. Phoenix was surprised and a little guilty when one of the packs opened to reveal 2 tents made of thin, waterproofed leather. It was certainly a change from sleeping in makeshift lean-tos or caves, and a very welcome relief from the chilly spring night air. Marcus and Bryn took charge of cooking, bantering light-heartedly over who would clean up afterward. Jade, still subdued, didn't protest. Phoenix eyed her uncertainly. He definitely wasn't going to ask why she wasn't cooking. He might not read books, but he wasn't stupid enough to ask a modern girl why she wasn't doing domestic chores. She'd probably whack him over the head with her quarterstaff and call him a pig, or worse, turn him into one. That didn't change the fact that he was worried about her. The night was perfectly clear and calm. Stars glittered brightly until a gibbous moon rose to dim them. The companions set watches, as usual. Truda was the only one exempt. When told, she complained so much that Jade eventually sighed and agreed to let her stay up with Bryn for first watch. Then she slipped quietly away into one of the tents. Marcus, Phoenix, and Bryn exchanged concerned looks. Phoenix raked a hand through his hair and decided there wasn't much they could do. He went to the other tent. It was still early, but there wasn't a whole lot to do other than sit around watching the campfire and stressing about stuff he had no control over. Anyway, he was tired enough to welcome the extra sleep. The night passed and they were disturbed only by the distant sound of a single, lonely wolf howl. Phoenix took last watch, shivering in the early morning chill, poking at the fire and watching yet another spectacular sunrise. At least this time, there were no rocks falling on his head. They had breakfasted and were striking camp when Jade held up a hand for silence. Obediently, the others stopped. She listened for a moment, an intent look on her face that made her sharp, elven features seem strangely pronounced. Then her eyes widened, and she stared across at Phoenix. "There's a horse coming fast." She glanced over her shoulder, from the direction of Ulshamar. Phoenix grimaced. "Marcus, would you please go out to the road and wait for it while we finish packing? It's probably nothing, but if it is a messenger for us, then he'll go right past." The Roman nodded and disappeared into the pine forest. Jade sent Phoenix a stricken look that showed just how bad she felt about leaving the villagers. He gestured for Bryn to keep packing the gear and sent her a reassuring smile. "It's probably nothing. Could be someone sending for a midwife, a bandit attack. Just a message for the next village. The queen suddenly craving blueberries," he said, trying to sound positive. Inside, he couldn't ignore a sinking feeling that it was something quite different. "Yes," Jade said quietly. "It could." For the next several moments, no one spoke. They all went about their duties silently, listening for the sound of hoofbeats. Sure enough, within seconds they could all hear what Jade had picked up. The sounds of a horse galloping full pace down the road toward them. Abruptly, they thudded to a stop and Jade lifted worried eyes toward the road. Marcus appeared again, followed by a breathless messenger boy leading a sweating horse. The Roman shook his head gravely as he entered the clearing. "We must return. The village has been attacked. Hrothgar is slain. Grendel's mother has taken her revenge." "Asulfur?" Jade's hushed question fell in the silence that followed. The messenger held up a reassuring hand and nodded. "By virtue of his new health, he was able to escape, my lady. He lives, as do the queen, the princess, and the young princes. But 20 thanes and warriors were slain as they slept in the great hall, Heorot, last night. Hrothgar took a party and followed the beast back to its lair, but he was killed when they attacked it." The boy swallowed and scrubbed tears from his red face. "My brother was the only survivor. He sent me to fetch you and beg you to help us once more, troll slayers." His blue eyes beseeched them as he glanced back and forth between Marcus and Phoenix. Phoenix exchanged resigned looks with Marcus, then drew Jade and Bryn nearer for a whispered conference. Truda sat on a stump, looking mulishly annoyed. "I hate to go backwards. We ought to be getting on with finding Asgard. We've only got 2 days left, remember," Phoenix murmured. Marcus frowned and Bryn bit his lip. Jade looked outraged. "You can't mean it, Phoenix," she hissed. "It's our fault those people are dead. We have to help them." He sighed. "I know how you feel, Jade, but remember where we are and who they are." He tapped the amulet lying beneath his shirt and rolled his eyes significantly, trying to remind her that they were just part of a digital world, not a real one. She had to be objective about this. If she kept getting emotionally involved with the characters in this game, they'd end up taking forever to get to level 5, if it were even possible. "We have to get Truda home before her birthday, remember?" "No, Jade is right," Marcus disagreed. "It's our duty to help these people. I could not be easy if we left without trying. I don't believe you could, either." The Roman gazed straightly at Phoenix, his dark eyes solemn. Bryn hesitated, one hand covering a pocket possessively. Jade glared at him. Finally he sighed and shrugged. "I guess we could go back if we have to." Phoenix echoed his sigh. This do-the-right-thing stuff was going to get them all killed one of these days. Having a conscience was a pain in the butt. Logically, he knew that their best option was to go ahead to Uppsala without wasting time. But that was just too cold-blooded for any of them. "All right, we go back, but..." He raised a warning finger. "If we try, and it looks like we have no hope of killing this thing, we evacuate the village and get the heck out of there." Agreed. We don't want to lose anyone on this little side trip. The other three exchanged glances and nodded, so they packed and rode as fast as they could south toward Ulshamar. After a while, they decided to put Bryn and Truda on the pack horses and ride on ahead. Bryn protested until Phoenix laid a heavy hand on his thin shoulder. "I'm asking you to take care of Truda, Bryn," Phoenix ordered. "You know she's the most valuable thing we have. She's the whole purpose of this quest. We have to take care of her first." He tightened his grip until the boy winced. "We need to help these people, too. You ride with Truda and the messenger. He'll find you somewhere safe to stay outside the village until we come back. Guard her with your life, Bryn. We're counting on you. Plus," he grinned, "I'm not sure you really want to go back to the village anyway, yes?" After a brief attempt to look innocent, Bryn had the grace to give an ashamed shrug and a half grin. Turning serious, he glanced at Truda, nodded curtly, and gripped Phoenix's forearm. He set his jaw and turned away to clamber onto the pony without another word. His dark eyes were fierce with awareness of his new duty. One hand clamped onto his new sword. Marcus lifted Truda up on the pack horse, tucking her in amongst their baggage. The messenger led her horse and Bryn's, as neither knew how to ride well enough to control their mounts. After giving the village boy final instructions, Jade, Marcus, and Phoenix put heels to their horses' flanks and galloped toward Ulshamar. Rank upon rank of huge, somber pines zipped past, even as time seemed to drag. To Phoenix, it seemed to take forever to cover the distance back to Ulshamar. Shoulder to shoulder with Jade's fleet-roan mare, his gray stallion flew over the rutted dirt track. Close behind, Marcus's bay pushed to keep up. Finally, they slowed to a trot as the village came in sight. Even from a distance, they could see the destruction wrought by the troll. Houses were flattened as though the beast had simply kicked down the thick walls. Workshops and stables were just piles of matchstick tinder. High on the hill, a column of black smoke rose above Heorot. In the village, people either wandered about as though they had no idea where to start, or worked tirelessly with blank expressions to restore their property. As the three companions approached, Asulfur came striding toward them, his face alight with relief. Beneath that, Phoenix could see pain and remembrance of fear and suffering that would last for years. A baby wailed somewhere nearby. Jade clutched at his arm, her expression distraught. "If we hadn't rushed off yesterday, we'd have been here to help them last night, Phoenix. We have to make things right." He nodded, knowing there was no argument this time. They shouldn't have left. "Well, we've done it once. We can do it again." He swung down off his horse and squared his shoulders, clenching his teeth against bile that rose at the sight of the devastation in the village. "And this time, we'll have your help too, so it should be easier." Jade's fingers tightened. He looked down to see her guilt had turned to fear. "But you said my magic won't work against a troll, Phoenix." Her nails dug into his arm. "I can't help you. Grendel's mother is supposed to be even worse than Grendel, and I can't do anything." Chapter 14, led by the sole survivor of Hrothgar's doomed group, the three companions, Asulfur and a party of 10 warriors, rode the last few meters toward the enormous lake east of Ulshamar. They dismounted at the top of a rocky cliff overlooking the water. Jade followed Phoenix and Marcus toward the edge, away from the war party. Silently, the three stared down. Below was a small, stony cove. A tiny stream trickled down a deep gorge to spill sparkling droplets into the lake's dark waters. It was late afternoon now, and the surface of the lake rippled under light, cold winds. A million wavelets glittered red in the sunset. The water looked deep and unforgiving, the gray rocks sharp and slippery. It was an ominous place. Phoenix stepped back, staring out across the vast expanse of water. "Okay, Jade." He turned to face her, glancing over as though to make sure the sphere warriors were well out of earshot. "You said you know this story. How does it go from here?" Jade swallowed and glanced down over the edge. She could once more sense the presence of a troll, and it played havoc with her thinking. Fear swelled up from her belly, trying to take control of her brain. A sense of impending doom pushed into her mind like a dark fog. Her legs began to shake. Desperately, she took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and tried a small spell on herself. "Relax." She willed the command spell on herself. Amazingly, it seemed to work. A gentle reassurance spread from a warm spot on her chest. It seeped into her limbs and brought clarity back to her mind. The amulet, she realized. Touching a fingertip to the gleaming metal, Jade felt a sudden surge of strength and power. She was okay. The fear was still there, but she could think through it now. Delighted, she opened her eyes to find Phoenix and Marcus staring at her in bewilderment. "What?" Phoenix began. Jade waved the question aside. There was no time. The sun sent golden fingers of fire across the lake as it set in spectacular fashion behind them. Grendel's mother would emerge soon. They had to come up with a plan. In Beowulf's story, he's given a sword, Hrunting, and he dives into the lake, under a headland. She indicated one of the rocky points jutting out into the water. He finds the cave, where the troll lives. He fingered his new sword. But this isn't Hrunting. It's Blodball, which is a way cooler name, by the way. And Hrothgar said it didn't work against trolls. "Exactly," Jade said, ignoring his comment about the name. "Hrunting doesn't either, but Beowulf doesn't find that out until he actually tries to kill her. Then he has a huge battle of strength that he knows he's losing. Luckily, he finds another magic sword lying about in the cave, and this one can and does kill her. Unfortunately, her blood dissolves the blade and Beowulf comes out with only the hilt. So he does survive then?" Phoenix asked. "You're sure?" "As much as I can be." She bit her lip and laid a hand on his arm. "I'm guessing here, Phoenix. She shook her head, irritated. "The programmers have mixed up their dates. I'm pretty annoyed with them, if you must know. The story of Beowulf isn't supposed to happen for another 500 years or so, and it's set in Denmark, not Sweden. Remind me to speak quite firmly to them about historical accuracy when we get home," he murmured. Jade sighed and chose to ignore the sarcasm. "The point is, how can I be sure they've stuck to the plot? Hrothgar gave you the wrong sword. He wasn't supposed to die, and the way you killed Grendel isn't part of the original story either. You were meant to rip off an arm so that he bled to death." Phoenix made a face. "Gross. And," he added, as an afterthought, "impossible, I'd say." Marcus nodded in wholehearted agreement. She gave them a worried half-smile. Beowulf was amazingly strong. "I rolled a 20 for strength, if that helps." Phoenix shrugged. "Really?" Jade blinked at him. He nodded, clearly pleased that he'd surprised her. "Well," she said firmly, "I still don't think you should rush into the cave and just hope there's a convenient, magical sword lying about, even one with a cool name. We need a plan." Phoenix looked at the dark, rippled water below and shuddered. "Sounds good to me. I'm not a very good swimmer anyway. Got one?" "Ah," Jade grimaced. "That's where we have a problem. I was hoping you might." "Me? You're the one with the big ideas all the time," he snorted. "But you're the one who defeated Grendel, remember?" "Don't remind me." Phoenix rubbed his ribs. "It was sheer luck. I don't think we could do it again if you paid us. Jade gave an exasperated huff, losing patience with his ill-timed humor. Well, you're the only ones with experience at this. Think of something. The sun's going down and that troll is going to come out and flatten us as soon as it's dark. He growled. I do know that. Geez, Jade. You're not the only one with a brain, you know. Well, sometimes it seems like it, she snapped. Think of something. You think of something? Phoenix shot back at her. You're the one who's so keen to be important. Come up with another smart-ass plan to save the day. I am not a smart-ass. Her voice broke and she turned her head away, fighting tears. Well, stop acting like it then. Phoenix crossed his arms over his chest. You keep trying to rub our noses in how smart and how special you are. Now's your chance. Save us all with your brilliance. They glared at each other. Jade felt her throat clamp shut as she struggled not to cry. Why was he being so horrible? It was just like being back at home with her sisters and mother. No matter what she did, it wasn't good enough. Would she ever be able to make everyone happy? There was a long, uncomfortable silence until Marcus stepped between his friends. He laid a hand on each and pushed them apart. Stop behaving like children, he ordered. You are adults. Both. Jade flushed and exchanged a guilty look with Phoenix. They still hadn't told Marcus that, although their avatar bodies were in their late teens, their real bodies were just barely into double digits. Sometimes, she realized, she just couldn't help acting like the kid she still was. At least, partly, Jade. Marcus turned his dark, solemn gaze on her and she squirmed inside. You know he deserves better. Phoenix, he addressed the warrior sternly. You know Jade has saved us several times already. She does not need to prove anything to us. Annoyance, then reluctant agreement, flickered across Phoenix's face as Jade watched. He opened his mouth, probably about to apologize. He never got a chance. Oh! Jade clutched at Marcus's arm, inspiration hitting. That's it. Both boys turned puzzled gazes on her. What? They asked in unison. The dryads. The magic horn Orphanon gave me. I keep forgetting we have it. Jade dropped her pack on the ground and yanked the Hylian Begia out of it. Reaching in, she named the item and felt its cool, smooth curves slap into her hand. She pulled it out, balancing it across her palms. In the rapidly fading sunlight, the three examined their prize, differences forgotten. It appeared to be some sort of curled sheep or goat horn. Both ends were edged with thin layers of beaten gold, the small one in the shape of a mouthpiece. The cream-colored horn between was carved with 1,000 intricate drawings that seemed to twist and shift in the graying light. How does it work? Phoenix poked it with a grubby finger. I think you just blow into the pointy end and sound comes out the fat end, Jade said with a touch of scorn, still a little hurt by the things he'd said. Thank you for that helpful hint. She stuck out her tongue at him, then felt like an idiot when Marcus sent her a mildly astonished look. I meant, Phoenix continued, didn't you say something about being in danger? Oh yes, Jade thought back. We have to be in dire peril. We can only use it 3 times, and the help that comes might not be what we expected. Fabulously vague. He still sounded like he was mocking her. Got any better ideas? He sighed and glanced at the sun, slipping rapidly behind hazy purple mountains. Around them, crickets began to chirrup. The horses whuffled and stamped as the temperature dropped. Nearby, the sphere warriors stared uneasily into the gathering darkness. No, but we're not exactly in dire peril, he admitted. Behind them, echoing out across the dark lake, came splashing followed by an awful grinding, crunching sound. It bounced off the cove's rocky walls, sounding like it came from a dozen directions. Everyone jumped. Jade whispered a light-making spell from her new spell book. A feeble greenish ball of light appeared in the palm of her hand, casting weird shadows on the anxious faces around her. "Somehow, I don't think it will be long before we are," she said shakily. "You can do magic?" Phoenix stared at the green light in surprise. "Even with a troll this close? Can you do any spells to help the situation?" Jade shook her head. "It's taking all my concentration just to keep this going. I can't help. I'm sorry." It grated to have to make that confession. She ought to be able to do something. Phoenix and Marcus exchanged weary, wary glances. "Here we go again," Phoenix murmured. "Let's get some torches happening. At least we can buy some time." Marcus nodded. Turning away, the Roman began to instruct the sphere warriors in the light torches and trees method of troll distraction. The ground-shaking grinding grew louder, and several battle-hardened warriors paled and began to back away. Asulfur spoke sharply to them, moving forward with a lit torch in his hand. At the sight of the old man stepping up, the younger warriors took heart and followed his lead. Phoenix peered over the cliff edge, then withdrew quickly, his eyes wide. "Man, she's huge!" Jade peeked over. She could just make out the silhouette of a massive, jagged creature clambering from the water far below. It was heading for the gorge, apparently its path to the top. "You guys outran and outwitted one of those." Her respect for Phoenix jumped a few notches. He shrugged, but she could tell he was pleased. Ours was a fair bit smaller, though. Still, together they watched the enormous rock creature as it moved toward the gorge with surprising speed and agility. "Can we do anything before she gets up here?" Jade asked hopefully. "Like what? Maybe roll big rocks down on her?" It was a long shot, she knew, but the thought of being chased down by that thing sent shivers down her spine. Phoenix frowned. "Aren't we just going to use the horn to blow for help when we get into trouble?" "So?" He raised an eyebrow. "What's the point in delaying it?" She shivered. "I guess I just want to stay as far away from that thing as I can." "Very wise," he said, slapping her on the back. "But we can hardly be in dire peril if we're a dozen miles away." "Nope. We may as well get it over with. I'll just go put myself in danger, shall I?" He concluded, annoyingly blasé. With a wave, he jogged over toward the narrow gorge that led to the bay. Jade stared after him for a moment, worried. She tightened her grip on the horn, ready to blow the minute Phoenix yelled for help. But Phoenix felt a whole lot less confident than he tried to sound. He regretted snapping at Jade, but he'd felt under pressure to come up with an answer. Thank goodness, she had once again pulled a viable plan out of her hat. Or bag, in this case. Unfortunately, he had a really bad feeling that, for the magic horn to work, he would have to put one of his lives on the line. All too clearly, he remembered the fearsome size of Grendel. Vivid images of that wild night reeled through his head until he had to grit his teeth and force his feet to move forward. Even worse, twinges of pain shot through his ankle, ribs, and the healed arrow wounds on his back. Dying again was the last thing he wanted to do. The very last. His legs felt leaden as he reached the lip of the gorge. Blood thundered in his ears and his breath grew shallow and quick at the thought of what was coming. Below, the grinding and crushing of great rocks told him the troll was climbing steadily upward, growling as she came. Instinctively, Phoenix reached for his sword. Its song burst into his mind, urging him to rush into battle, to die in glorious, bloody defeat. Shaken, he slowly resheathed it. He knew it wouldn't work, but its insidious song was hard to resist. There was no point in breaking a perfectly good magic sword. Still, he felt naked without something in his hand. On cue, a burning torch was thrust into his palm. He gripped it gratefully. "You're using yourself as bait?" Marcus sounded almost angry. Phoenix gave a half shrug. "I'll join you," the Roman boy stated. Alarm shot through Phoenix. "No way! I'm not really in any danger, but you are. Get away from here, Marcus." "I mean it." He glared at his friend. Marcus shook his head. "I can't, in good conscience, leave a sword brother to face such danger alone." "You would do the same for me." Phoenix wasn't so sure of that. He had the security of knowing he had more lives. If he didn't, he wasn't certain he'd be brave enough to offer what Marcus did. He pulled out his dagger and brandished the ruby-studded hilt at his companion. "I'll be okay. Remember?" Marcus stared at him, then down at the dagger, obviously unwilling to believe in his ability to overcome death. "Are you certain?" Phoenix swallowed hard and nodded, trying to ignore a flicker of doubt in his guts. "Go keep the villagers from panicking and getting killed." The Roman stood still for a moment, staring at him, undecided. Phoenix felt a surge of gratitude for his loyalty. No one in his world had ever shown him such unswerving support. The Roman had been brought up in a world where such unshakable loyalty was expected. Phoenix found it uncomfortable and hard to accept. He reached out and gave him a shove. "Go, Marcus, be safe." Marcus gripped his arm. "And you, my friend." Phoenix turned his back on his friend and stared into the darkness, afraid his face might give away how alone he felt. Would dying hurt this time? There was no doubt he was destined to die at least once tonight. How could being squashed by a 10-ton foot not be painful? The question was, how long would he have to stand it before he died? How would he come back if he were squashed flat? For a brief, silly moment, he felt an insane urge to giggle. A cartoon-style vision had come into his head, himself squished perfectly flat, then blowing on his own thumb to pop himself back to full size. Unsure, he checked his dagger again. Yes, there were still 6 glowing rubies in the hilt. Surely that had to mean he had 6 lives left. Doubt flared again. What if, somehow, the druid's spring rites had cured him last time? What if it were just a coincidence that 1 ruby in his dagger was broken? What if the 7 lives rule didn't apply to him and Jade because they were actually in the computer game, not just playing it? An instinctive fear for his own life gripped him. It was just stupid to deliberately let himself be killed again. Totally nuts. Slowly, he began to back away from the edge of the gorge. There had to be another way. Then he took a deep, slow breath and a tightened grip on his torch. There was no other way. Someone had to be in danger for the horn to work. He could do this. He could. He'd outrun and outsmarted one troll already with just Marcus to help. This time he had a whole backup team. He was not alone. Hard as it was, he just had to have faith in them and in himself. Decisively, Phoenix stepped back toward the gorge, listening and watching. Sweat trickled down his forehead as he strained to see the troll in the darkness. Something was wrong. It took a second for the change to register. Then it clicked. While he'd been thinking about dying, the troll had taken a different path. The sounds of her climbing no longer echoed up the rocky gorge. She had moved around to the cliff face. As he turned, a shrill scream pierced the darkness. Peering past the light of his own torch, Phoenix saw Jade stumbling away from the precipice. The greenish witchlight she had cast bobbed at her shoulder, illuminating her terrified face. She wasn't looking in his direction. She was looking at the sheer drop before her. There, hauling itself awkwardly over the edge, was the troll. It was now less than 20 meters away from where Jade stood. "Jade? Run!" Phoenix heard Marcus's yell echo his own as they both started toward her. She half turned, but glanced back over her shoulder at the beast. It loomed closer. There was no way they could reach her in time to distract it. "Phoenix!" Jade's despairing, urgent cry tore at him. He ran faster, legs pumping, Marcus thudding beside him. "The horn!" Marcus shouted. Phoenix looked up hopefully. Jade put the golden mouthpiece to her lips as she ran. A wobbly, faint note sounded, like the muffled tone of a distant trumpet. It sent a shiver down his spine and made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Phoenix glanced around, expecting instant results. Nothing happened. It was too late, anyway. Phoenix and Marcus could do nothing as a great rocky arm swung in an unstoppable arc toward Jade's sprinting form. They could do nothing as it connected sickeningly and carried on swinging. Nothing, as Jade's limp body flew through the air toward them and landed, broken and twisted, at their feet. Chapter 15. "Jade!" Marcus's hoarse cry echoed across the dark lake. He and Phoenix reached her motionless form at the same time. Phoenix risked a quick look up at the troll, relieved to see it had turned away from them. Several sphere warriors were taunting it, waving their torches about, yelling abuse and curses at it, trying to lead it away. Marcus crouched beside her, his fingers on her throat. The Roman looked up at Phoenix and shook his head. His jaw was clenched, dark eyes stricken. "She's dead." Phoenix crouched too, elbows resting on his knees. Jade looked as if she were sleeping, except that her neck was twisted in a way that would not have been possible if she were alive. Her right leg and arm both lay at awkward angles. There was a thin trickle of blood coming from her mouth. He swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. She wasn't really dead. She had just lost one of her 7 lives. That was all. He struggled to reassure himself, but worry kept welling up in him. Maybe he'd been right before. Maybe the 7 lives thing wasn't part of the game. Maybe she was truly dead, and he was alone. Maybe he would have to fight with this weird world on his own. Damn it, he'd gotten used to having Jade around. How was he supposed to win the game without her? How could she do something so stupid? Phoenix found he was shaking all over. He fought the urge to hit something, to run somewhere. Anywhere but here. Trying to think logically, he drew a deep breath. A quick look at the handle of her dagger showed that one of the 7 rubies had indeed cracked and dulled. His shoulders slumped in relief. Maybe there was still hope. If she was going to recover, they would have to at least give her body a chance to heal itself. It had to be impossible to come back to life all twisted up like that. Resolutely, he reached out and turned her onto her back. Her limbs flopped unpleasantly. Marcus uttered a wordless protest, then reached out to help as he realized what Phoenix was doing. Together the boys laid their friend out straight on the rocky ground, hands crossed on her chest, eyes peacefully closed. "Will she?" Marcus asked in a choked voice. He laid calloused fingers gently against her cheek, staring at her serene countenance. "I think so." Phoenix's voice shook. "I hope so." Well, she had to. Had to. He couldn't bear to think of the consequences if she didn't. From somewhere behind them came a frustrated, gravelly roar from the troll mother, followed by the crackling sound of a burning tree and the strong scent of pine smoke. Then the ruckus of shouting warriors and thunderous troll feet was coming closer again. "We have to get her somewhere safer, though," Phoenix decided. Stooping, he picked up the horn of Orphanon and jammed it into Jade's pack. Fat lot of good blowing that stupid thing had done. Where was the help it had promised? How were they supposed to kill the troll now? Damn Jade for coming up with such a brainless idea anyway. With teeth gritted against the anxiety that thudded in his chest, he handed the pack to Marcus and scooped Jade up in his arms. Her head lolled back, pale hair almost touching the ground. She was lighter than he thought, her skin still warm. He almost expected to feel a heartbeat beneath his fingers. She couldn't be really dead. His thoughts seesawed between helpless denial and unreasonable resentment at her foolhardiness. Please, please don't let her be dead. The chant ran ceaselessly through his head as he turned away from the cliff. A cold, swirling wind sprang up around them. With it came the fresh scent of earth, horses, dogs, and, oddly, a hint of sweet wine. Eddies caught at their hair and clothes, fluttering Jade's cloak and hair like butterfly wings. Phoenix heard the faint, haunting sound of a hunting horn, followed by the baying of hounds and the soft drift of wild laughter and music. "What is it?" Marcus's hushed voice sounded at his shoulder. Phoenix stared into the darkness, puzzled. "It sounds like there's a hunt of some sort going on out there." "A hunt?" Marcus was incredulous. "At night. Strange, all right," he agreed, "especially since it's coming from out over the lake." He peered into the night. Again, the eerie wail of a hunting horn echoed thinly through the cold air, closer this time. The hounds bayed louder, but they couldn't yet hear the thunder of hooves. Distant greenish lights flickered over the dark water. Laughter and song ebbed and flowed with the wash of lively music, but it all had a weird, otherworldly quality that set Phoenix's teeth on edge. "There," Marcus pointed out across the lake toward a must of bobbing pale green lights. "I see them, but what exactly are they?" Phoenix squinted through the darkness. "I have no idea." Several tense moments passed. The swaying lights drew nearer as the two boys watched, spellbound. They barely even registered the now distant noises of sphere warriors leading the troll away through the forest. Finally, the lights were close enough to illuminate the folk who bore them aloft. "By Jupiter's beard," Marcus swore softly. "What the—" Phoenix had no idea what to say, so he let his words trail off as they stared in awe. A multitude of merrymaking hunters galloped majestically toward the cliff. Seated on horses that practically glowed white were 20 or more of the most beautiful, frightening people Phoenix had ever seen. Impossibly tall, severely elegant, and unbearably handsome. Each rider wore a shimmering midnight blue belted tunic over breeches tucked into high boots. Many of them had gray cloaks, falling gracefully from their shoulders to drape across their horses' withers. All had long white blonde hair, pale skin, and high, sharp cheekbones. Several carried torches burning with an eerie greenish light that immediately reminded Phoenix of the magic radiance Jade had cast. Did cast. He corrected himself silently. All bore hunting bows and swords or daggers of some silvery metal, glinting purple-blue in the torchlight. Some also held and played a strange assemblage of musical instruments, harps, flutes, and drums he'd never seen before. Their eerie music plucked at Phoenix's brain, distracting him and filling him with a deep sense of unease. Gamboling about the riders were a dozen enormous dogs. Pure white, with red ears and glowing red eyes, they were a frightening sight as they came closer. By far the oddest thing, though, was that both their steeds and dogs pranced at least 50 feet above the surface of the lake. As the moon began to rise in the east, they rode on air and moonbeams. Marcus dropped a hand to his sword. "They are elven kind, Jade's folk. They must be." Phoenix saw the similarities and the pointed ears. Jade did look like them, but in a more human way. It was as if all the exaggerated, almost alien beauty of these riders had, in her face, been softened into loveliness more acceptable to humans. "You're right," he whispered back. "But that doesn't explain who they are or why they're here." At that moment, the whole cavalcade spilled over the cliff edge and reined to a halt only meters away from the two warriors. On a curt command, the dogs sat obediently beside their masters. The group formed a rough wedge behind one person, a terrifyingly tall, elegant male dressed similarly to the others, but with a cloak of silver and a thin, silver coronet around his forehead. His eyes were the blackest pits of boredom, his expression faintly contemptuous. Phoenix felt distinctly at a disadvantage. He still held Jade's limp form in his arms, but he didn't dare drop her to snatch at a weapon. Keeping half an eye on the newcomers, he tried to look casual and non-threatening as he laid her gently on the cold ground at his feet. Resting a hand on his new sword, he stepped over her. The music stopped. The horses and dogs came to a complete halt. Phoenix felt as if 20 pairs of slanted elvish eyes were focused on him, which, unfortunately, they were. He gulped, wishing for Bryn's roguish tongue. Remembering his manners, he bowed jerkily. He had a vague idea that elves were a lot more powerful than Jade, and a lot more arrogant. Probably best to be polite. "My lords," he began. The leader held up a slender hand and stared coolly down at him. "What mortal dares summon the wild hunt?" Disdain chilled his voice. Caught off guard, Phoenix exchanged frantic glances with Marcus. Then the Roman's eyes widened, and he glanced at Jade's backpack, dangling from his fingers. The horn, of course. Jade's use of the magic horn had summoned them. Relieved to have cleared up that mystery, Phoenix bowed again. "We did, my lord," he managed. "By what right do you possess the Horn of Orphanon?" the elven leader demanded. Phoenix thought fast. If he gave the wrong answer, would they leave without helping? "By right of gift, my lord." He waved a hand at Jade's inert shape. "Our companion met and was befriended by Queen Orphanon in Albion. The Queen lent us the horn to help us complete our quests. We used the horn to summon help, but we didn't know what form the aid would take." The Elven King leaned forward in his saddle, staring past Phoenix at Jade. His expression tightened to something close to dismay. Phoenix felt his heart rate jump. What if he thought they'd killed Jade, a half-elf? They stood no chance at all against 20 well-armed elves. Without warning, the Elven King swung down off his mount. His followers exchanged startled, wary glances. Phoenix and Marcus moved to protect their fallen comrade, but the king raised one thin eyebrow at them and stared until they edged aside. He knelt gracefully beside Jade, his frown deepening as he brushed hair from her face. What color were her eyes? Phoenix stared at him blankly. The question was so unexpected, he didn't know what to say. The king stood swiftly, towering over him, his expression bleak. "Green, sir," Marcus put in quietly, coming to his rescue. At this, the king's already pale face turned ashen. He closed his eyes briefly, glanced back down at Jade, then drew himself up, his face once more cold and haughty. "If you have called us to save her from death, then we are too late." With a swirl of his cloak, he turned away and placed a foot in the stirrup, preparing to mount. "No," Phoenix called. "We called for aid in destroying a troll." The elven leader paused for a second, considering. He shook his head. "We are not interested in hunting trolls. Farewell." "But this troll killed the Sphere King and many of his people," Phoenix said urgently. "And it did this to Jade." He couldn't explain why he'd said it. He just hoped the elves would want to be revenged on whoever killed their kin. He was right. A frightening sternness came over the king's narrow face. His dark eyes blazed with anger. In one smooth movement, he swung onto his horse. Rapidly, he spoke over his shoulder in Elvish. Half of his troop nodded, smiled with devilish delight, and spurred their steeds toward the distant sounds of troll-wrought destruction. Their horses' hooves made no sound, skimmed above the earth. The dogs followed, baying again. Phoenix, Marcus, and the rest of the elves stood frozen, listening. Moments later came the satisfying sound of trollish frustration and the spine-tingling laughter of elves on the hunt. The two warriors gaped as 10 elven hunters appeared above the forest. Bound in a dozen slender silvery ropes, dangling between the horses and dogs, threshed the roaring shape of Grendel's mother. Still laughing, the elves galloped overhead, out across the lake, heading east. As the grinding sound of the troll's anger faded, Phoenix managed to shut his jaw and turn back to the elven king. The elf gazed down at him with faint humor. He inclined his head regally. "It is done. The troll will be carried into the morning sun, then dropped into the sea. Now may we go?" he asked, his voice tinged with irony. Phoenix flushed. Obviously, his little ploy to involve the elves by appealing to their desire for revenge had not gone unnoticed. Plucking up his courage, he managed one more question. "We need to get to Uppsala quickly. Can you help us?" The king frowned again, his slanted brows snapping together. "What of your fallen companion? Is she worth no more than a cold grave above ground? Will you not bury her with dignity?" Phoenix took a deep breath. Here was the crucial moment. Would the king be angry when he found out Jade might not be permanently dead? "I believe she can be returned to us, good sir, if you will give us further aid this night. Will you?" "Returned to you." The elven king's face showed quick series of emotions that baffled Phoenix. Anger, disbelief, then finally hope. "By what manner of magic can you, a mortal, restore life?" he asked haughtily. "She and I are unique in this world, my lord." He searched for the right words. "I can only say that I believe she will recover if given a chance. It's worth a try. A non-answer if ever I heard one, warrior." The king was not deceived. "However, we all have our secrets, do we not?" He glanced one more time at Jade's still face. "Very well. We shall take you to Alfheimer." He paused for a moment, staring over Phoenix's shoulder at the forest behind. A thin smile pulled at his lips. "Shall we also take the little godling who lurks among the trees, watching? She would appear to be far from home." Phoenix and Marcus sighed in unison and turned around. "Truda!" Phoenix yelled. "You can come out now!" There was a moment of silence, and then 2 small figures stepped out from the shrubbery. In front strode Truda, proud as any princess. Behind her, looking sheepish, came Bryn. He led their pack horses and cast awed glances at the glowing elven host. When they were close enough, Truda exchanged stately nods with the king, who luckily chose not to take offense. Bryn bowed deeply and received a scornful glance from his young companion. "How did you get here?" Phoenix demanded. "I wanted you two safe outside the village." "That messenger didn't want to miss out on the fight." Bryn was breathless. "He led us here. What were we supposed to do?" He spread his hands, giving his best innocent look. Phoenix didn't believe him for a moment, but whatever he'd intended to say was cut short when the boy caught sight of Jade's body. Bryn gasped in horror, his eyes wide. He dropped the reins and threw himself over her with a wail of despair. He grabbed her slim shoulders and shook her. "Jade, Jade, wake up!" When she didn't, He buried his face in her neck and sobbed. Truda stood by, looking troubled. Marcus hurried over to Bryn, dragging the boy aside, murmuring explanations and reassurance into his ear. Slowly, Bryn's tears dried. He sniffed and wiped his face on his sleeve. "Do you really think?" He cast hopeful glances between Phoenix, Marcus, and the Elven King. "I'm hoping we can bring her back," Phoenix said for at least the third time, and hopefully the last. "But I think we need to do it fast, or she may be gone forever." Truthfully, he had no idea if this was right, but he was getting pretty tired of explaining. Each time he did, he had to suppress the fear that he might be wrong, that Jade was already gone forever. Even if she weren't, then it was time to move on. The troll was gone. They'd done their duty by the village. Now they needed to get on with their own quest before Judai found them, or something else nasty decided to get in their way. Glancing up at the Elven King's cold, aloof eyes, Phoenix wondered briefly if they hadn't jumped into the proverbial fire. The elves didn't exactly look thrilled to be taking on passengers. Drifting in and out of sleep, Long Bayou felt death like a hot needle in his mind. He awoke with a gasp, eyes wide in the darkness of his cell. Cautiously, he cast his thoughts out. He needed help again. In her between-life state, she could be reached, taught, helped, without Judai's knowledge. He couldn't risk reaching that far again himself. Judai had sealed the breach in his mental shields. There was one, however, who could again be of assistance. Chapter 16. Jade swam slowly up from great depths, shying away from the memory of shattering pain, of utter blackness, of nothingness, into a familiar gray world of shifting fogs and whispered, half-heard voices. Unafraid, she drifted for what seemed like eternity in this limbo, chasing voices, peering into the mists, wondering how to find her way home. At last, a voice murmured her name clearly, a vaguely familiar voice, kind, tired, and patient. She turned toward it eagerly, hoping to see a face, but found only more fog. The voice called again, whispering reassurances at first, then instructions, information she'd never read about this game world, what the next 3 quests entailed, what countries they would encounter, a basic outline of what they needed to do in each. The voice faded eventually, getting fainter and more exhausted until it stopped altogether. Jade called out, hoping to find out more, but to no avail. She was once again alone in limbo, trying desperately to remember everything she'd heard. Now, a different voice called, one she recognized, but couldn't put a name to. Puzzled, she turned toward it. Drawn by a green-gold glow, she floated reluctantly out of suspension and back to life. With a gasp, Jade sat up, eyes wide. She felt her body, patting it to make sure she had all her arms and legs, her head, her face. Everything felt okay. Tentatively, she rotated her shoulders, expecting pain. After all, her last memory had been of a massive troll fist crashing into her frail body. Nothing seemed amiss. Everything appeared to be functioning fine. How strange. Jade. Another familiar voice drew her attention. This one she could name. Phoenix knelt beside her bed, looking both anxious and thankful. Behind him stood Marcus, his normally solemn expression one of relief. Next to him, Bryn clutched at Phoenix's shoulder with wide-eyed disbelief. Suddenly, the boy threw himself into Jade's arms. "I thought you were dead," he howled. "Don't ever do that again. I don't want to lose you, too." Jade patted his thin back, wondering how to remind him it was probably going to happen at least another 5 times, if she couldn't avoid it. Finally his sobs subsided, and he moved away, wiping his grubby face with an equally grubby sleeve. "Where are we?" she asked, bemused. She was in some sort of bedroom. That much was obvious. It was a room unlike any she'd ever seen. The walls were some sort of almost translucent white stone. The blocks fitted so smoothly that she could barely see the joins. The bed on which she lay was an enormous canopied affair that dripped velvet curtains and gold tassels. All around were exotically designed pieces of furniture ornamented with plant designs picked out in gold leaf. Through a huge arched window, she could only see darkness and faint stars. "We're in Alfheim," Phoenix replied. "The elves only just let us in to see you." "Alfheim?" She frowned, trying to connect the dots. "Oh, Elfhome, the home of the elves in Norse mythology. How did we get here?" Swiftly, Phoenix told of the arrival of the elven wild hunt, the destruction of the troll, his plea to the elven king. Jade stared at him with amazement. Asking elves for anything was either impressively brave or astonishingly ignorant. They were known to be tricksy, fickle folk when dealing with mortals. She was pretty sure Phoenix had been oblivious to the danger, although she had to admit that he'd shown a fair amount of bravery in the last couple of weeks. When he finished, she frowned. "So how did we get to Alfheim, then?" The others exchanged glances, all three looking a little paler. "The king gave our horses the ability to fly. Temporarily, I hope," Phoenix added with a shudder. "We traveled over what he called Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge. Kind of a solid rainbow into the sky then, somewhere else. Here, I guess." He shook himself again as if to be rid of a bad memory. "Honestly, I hope we never have to do it again. It was a long, long way up and there were no handrails. Terrifying," Bryn put in, shivering. "Most unpleasant, I must admit," Marcus agreed. Oh yes, Jade recalled what she knew of Norse mythology. Bifrost connects Midgard to Asgard. I didn't know it went to Alfheim too. "I thought we had to go down the roots of that tree Truda told us about. Yggdrasil or whatever," Bryn complained. "Yggdrasil," Jade corrected. "Yeah, that's the other way to get here. I guess this was easier." "Debatable," Phoenix muttered. Jade chose not to dignify that with an answer. She had something more important on her mind. "Where's Truda?" "She's with the king and his court." "Why?" Phoenix was puzzled. "Don't you understand?" The others shook their heads. "I've just remembered. The world of Alfheim is on the same level as Asgard, under the roots of the Yggdrasil tree. From here we should be able to get across to Asgard." Jade was almost exploding with excitement as she recalled soft words whispered while she floated in limbo. They were finally nearing the end of level 2. "Don't you see? All we have to do is get there, return Truda to Thor before her birthday, and steal his..." Her words ground to a halt as she met Phoenix's skeptical gaze. "Yes, I suppose we're not really that much better off, are we? Stealing the hammer was always going to be the hardest part." Sighing, she slumped back on her pillows as exhaustion swept over her. Marcus leaned in, concerned. "You probably should rest." Phoenix nodded and quirked a knowing grin at her. "Being dead sure takes it out of you, doesn't it?" Jade smiled a little. "Speaking of being dead, where's my knife?" Silently, Marcus handed her belt knife. She inspected the handle. Sure enough, one of the rubies was blackened and cracked through the middle. Only 6 left. Scary. Phoenix grinned again. "An old friend of yours gave us some help. She and her ladies have been looking after you." He glanced at the door. It opened and a familiar figure entered. She sat up, surprised. "Orphanon." Sure enough, the Golden Queen of the Dryads glided gracefully toward the bed. Phoenix and the others withdrew a little, leaving her space to sit beside Jade. The Queen sank onto the outsmarts mattress, with hardly a sigh of her fine linen dress. She smiled, the corners of her amber eyes crinkling pleasantly. Reaching out, she placed a cool hand on Jade's forehead. "You are well, child." Her voice was a whisper of wind through autumn leaves. Jade nodded. "Thank you. How did you get here?" "You were in England, Albion, in Anoeth, the timeless land of the elven folk there. How can you be here, so far from your oak tree?" As far as she knew, dryads were tied to their trees. Surely Sweden was too far away for Orphanon to travel. The queen smiled again. "Silly child, the Anoeth is not like the mortal world. It is ever